Hello there, and welcome to History for Lunatics. I'm glad you are here tonight. Settle into whatever place you have chosen. Let the room become quiet around you. Maybe you are listening from bed, maybe from a couch after a long day, or perhaps through headphones while the rest of the house has already gone still. Wherever you are about to enter a version of New York that millions of people walk through every day without ever fully seeing. Tonight, we're not going to visit the New York of bright theatre signs, crowded department stores, yellow taxis, or elegant hotels. We're going beneath all of that, into the back rooms of restaurants, the private booths of social clubs, the warehouses near the river, the union offices above ordinary storefronts, and the quiet conversations that could determine who received a contract, who kept a job, and who suddenly discovered that doing business in the city had become impossible. This is the story of the five families and the period when organised crime became so deeply connected to New York that it could no longer be dismissed as a collection of neighbourhood gangs. It became a system. It had rules, ranks, territories, councils, revenue streams, political contacts, lawyers, accountants, informants, and methods of discipline. It reached from gambling rooms and illegal bars into construction sites, shipping docks, garment factories, trucking companies, restaurants, labour unions, and public contracts. In some industries, the Mafia did not merely participate in the economy, it decided who was allowed to participate. Before we begin, let me ask you something. What time is it where you are right now? Is your city still awake? Can you hear traffic outside? Or has everything gone quiet? And where are you listening from tonight? New York, Chicago, London, Toronto, Sydney, or somewhere much smaller and far removed from the streets we're about to enter? You can leave your location in the comments. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. If this kind of slow historical storytelling helps you settle in, you can give the video a like and subscribe to the channel. There is no need to interrupt what you're doing. You can do it whenever the moment feels right. For now, allow the present to move into the background as we return to a city that was growing faster than almost anyone could control. Imagine New York in the early decades of the 20th century. The city is loud from morning until long after dark. Elevated trains rattle above the avenues. Streetcars ring their bells through crowded intersections. Horses still pull carts through neighbourhoods where automobiles are becoming more common each year. Steam rises from grates. Ships arrive at the docks carrying food, machinery, mail and people. Factories release thousands of workers at the end of each shift. Apartment windows remain open in summer because the rooms are hot, crowded and poorly ventilated. Conversations drift from one building to another in Italian, Yiddish, English, German, Irish accents, and the languages of families who have only recently crossed the Atlantic. New York is already becoming one of the most important cities in the world, but it is also a city of intense insecurity. Work can disappear without warning. Injury can ruin a family. Police protection is inconsistent. Political machines exchange favours for votes. Local officials often depend on neighbourhood leaders to maintain order, deliver support, and solve problems before those problems reach a courtroom. In many immigrant districts, the government feels distant. The landlord is real. The factory foreman is real. The ward politician is real. The man who controls hiring at the docks is real. The police officer may appear occasionally, but the people who shape daily life are usually much closer. This is where the story becomes complicated. The Mafia did not arrive in New York as a complete organisation with 5 clearly defined families and a central governing body. It developed over time from older traditions, local criminal groups, protection rackets, political corruption, labour disputes, smuggling networks, and the opportunities created by a rapidly expanding city. The men who eventually built the 5 families did not invent crime in New York. Crime was already everywhere. What they helped create was a more stable structure for managing it. At first, much of the activity was local and disorganised. A man with a reputation for violence might demand payment from shopkeepers in exchange for protection. The protection was often protection from the same people collecting the money. A business owner who refused could have his windows broken, his goods stolen, or his shop set on fire. Threatening letters sometimes carried crude drawings of weapons, skulls, or black hands. Newspapers began using the term Black Hand to describe these extortion schemes. The phrase made the crimes sound as though they were controlled by one hidden organisation. They were not. The Black Hand was not a single national society with one leader or a unified command. It was a method used by different criminals, often independently. Yet to families receiving anonymous letters demanding money, the distinction offered little comfort. Italian immigrants were frequently the victims of these crimes, not their willing supporters. Many had come to the United States to escape poverty, political instability, or limited opportunities. They found themselves living in dense neighbourhoods where honest work was available but poorly paid, where language barriers made legal protection difficult to obtain, and where criminals could take advantage of fear and silence. Most Italian immigrants had nothing to do with organised crime. They built businesses, raised families, joined unions, entered trades, and gradually became part of the wider life of the city. But criminal groups operating within certain neighbourhoods used shared language and regional connections to conceal their activities. They also understood that victims who distrusted the authorities were less likely to cooperate with police. The early criminals were not glamorous. They did not live like film stars. Many were crude, violent, and short-lived. They fought over streets, gambling games, protection payments, and access to political favours. Their organisations were unstable because authority depended heavily on personal fear. When a leader died or went to prison, the group could split into smaller factions. Then the United States made a decision that transformed these local criminals into something far more powerful. In January 1920, national prohibition took effect. The manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating alcohol became illegal under federal law. Americans did not suddenly stop drinking. Instead, the legal supply disappeared while demand remained. A vast illegal market opened almost overnight. This was the opportunity ambitious criminals had been waiting for. Alcohol could be imported, stolen, manufactured, transported, stored, diluted, bottled, sold, and protected. Each part of that chain created profit. It also required coordination. A neighbourhood gang could run a small gambling room or collect payments from a few businesses, but bootlegging demanded trucks, warehouses, drivers, mechanics, armed guards, bribed officials, distribution networks, and relationships with thousands of illegal drinking establishments. The speakeasy became one of the defining institutions of the Prohibition era. Some were hidden behind unmarked doors. Others operated openly because the owners had paid the right police officers or politicians. Customers entered restaurants, basements, private clubs and apartments to drink beer, whiskey, gin and wine that had reached the city through criminal supply networks. Every glass represented several crimes. Someone had produced or imported the alcohol. Someone had transported it. Someone had paid for protection. Someone had arranged the sale. Someone had collected the profits. The money was enormous. Bootlegging gave criminal leaders enough revenue to hire more men, purchase political protection, corrupt police departments, employ lawyers, bribe jurors, and expand into other industries. It also rewarded organisation. The groups that planned carefully survived. The groups that relied only on street violence often destroyed themselves. By the middle of the 1920s, New York's criminal world was becoming more professional, but it was not yet orderly. Italian and Sicilian organisations competed with Irish and Jewish gangs, independent bootleggers, local political operators, and countless smaller crews. Alliances could cross ethnic lines when money required it, even though older leaders often preferred to work only with men from familiar backgrounds. Among the younger generation, that old way of thinking began to seem inefficient. Several ambitious criminals believed there was more money to be made through cooperation than through constant neighbourhood war. They were not troubled by working with people from different regions or ethnic backgrounds. They cared about reliability, profit, and power. Their partnerships would eventually change organised crime across the United States. One of the most important of these men was Charles Luciano, better known as Lucky Luciano. Luciano was born Salvatore Lucania in Sicily in 1897 and arrived in New York as a child. He grew up on the Lower East Side, an area where poverty, street gangs, political machines and criminal opportunity existed within a few blocks of one another. He developed relationships with figures who would later become major names in American organised crime, including Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Siegel. Lansky was Jewish, Luciano was Sicilian, and in the older criminal culture that difference might have prevented close cooperation. Luciano belonged to a younger generation that saw such restrictions as obstacles. If a man could make money, keep his word, and understand the risks, Luciano was willing to work with him. This did not make him tolerant in any moral sense. It made him practical. Luciano and his associates operated in a world where murder was an accepted business tool. They were involved in gambling, bootlegging, extortion, prostitution, and other rackets. They did not hesitate to use violence when it served their interests. The modern image of Luciano as a clever reformer can obscure the basic fact that he was building a criminal enterprise. His innovations made organised crime more efficient, not less destructive. Still, efficiency mattered. It would become the foundation of the system that followed. At the time, two older Sicilian leaders dominated much of New York's Italian underworld. One was Giuseppe Masseria, usually called Joe the Boss. The other was Salvatore Maranzano. Their struggle for control became known as the Castellamarese War, named for the Sicilian town of Castellammare del Golfo, where many of Maranzano's supporters had connections. The conflict was not a conventional war with clear front lines. It was a series of killings, betrayals, shifting loyalties and business pressures. Men were shot in restaurants, on sidewalks, in offices, and inside cars. Each murder created fear and uncertainty. Crews wondered whether their leaders could protect them. Business operations became harder to manage. Profits suffered. For younger mobsters such as Luciano, the war represented everything wrong with the old leadership. Masseria and Maranzano were fighting for personal supremacy, while the criminal economy around them was becoming larger and more complex. Bootlegging networks crossed state lines. Gambling operations handled large amounts of money. Political and labour connections required careful management. Constant violence attracted attention and made long-term planning difficult. The old bosses wanted obedience. The younger men wanted a structure that could survive beyond one individual. In April 1931, Joe Masseria sat down for a meal at a restaurant on Coney Island. At some point, Luciano reportedly left the table. Gunmen entered and killed Masseria. The exact details have been repeated and altered over the years, as often happens with Mafia stories, but the result was clear. Masseria was dead, and Maranzano appeared to have won the war. Maranzano reorganised the Italian criminal groups in New York. He divided them into 5 major organisations and placed a boss over each one. These organisations would eventually become known as the Bonanno, Colombo, Gambino, Genovese, and Lucchesi families, although those names came later. Maranzano also adopted a formal hierarchy, influenced by military language and older Sicilian traditions. At the top stood the boss. Beneath him was the underboss. An advisor, later widely known as the consigliere, offered counsel. Captains supervised groups of soldiers. Associates worked with the organisation without necessarily being formally inducted members. The structure created clearer authority, but Maranzano made one decision that placed him in danger. He declared himself capo di tutti capi, the boss of all bosses. To Maranzano, the title confirmed his victory. To Luciano and his allies, it suggested that nothing had truly changed. One old dictator had simply replaced another. Only a few months after Masseria's death, Maranzano was killed in his Manhattan office by men posing as government agents. The murder removed the final major obstacle to Luciano's plan. Instead of allowing another boss to claim supreme authority, Luciano helped establish a governing arrangement that became known as the Commission. The Commission was designed to settle disputes, recognise leadership changes, approve major decisions, and prevent wars that could damage everyone's business. It did not eliminate violence. It did not create peace in any ordinary sense. What it did was provide a forum through which powerful criminal organisations could manage conflict without immediately resorting to open war. This was the point at which New York's underworld began to resemble an institution rather than a loose collection of gangs. The five families each controlled crews, territories, and business interests. Their influence overlapped. They competed, cooperated, argued, and sometimes killed one another. Yet they also shared an interest in secrecy and stability. Public disorder threatened profits. A dead body could solve one problem while creating 10 others. Police attention, newspaper coverage, frightened politicians, and angry citizens were bad for business. The most successful mobsters learned to separate the appearance of the city from the machinery operating beneath it. A truck might deliver legitimate goods during the day and transport stolen merchandise at night. A restaurant could serve families in the front room while gambling debts were discussed in the back. A union office could negotiate real improvements for workers while also collecting illegal payments from employers. A construction company might perform genuine work but be forced to use Mafia-approved suppliers. A nightclub could entertain politicians, celebrities, tourists, and criminals in the same evening. This mixture of legal and illegal activity made the system difficult to attack. The Mafia was rarely located in one building that could simply be raided and closed. It existed through relationships. One man controlled hiring, another arranged loans, another passed information from a police precinct, another collected money from gambling operations, another owned a legitimate company that could be used to hide criminal profits, another knew which judge might be approached through an intermediary. Many participants never saw the whole organisation. They did not need to. A dock worker might know who controlled access to jobs on his pier. A restaurant owner might know whom to pay each month. A contractor might understand that refusing a certain supplier would lead to delays. A bookmaker might send part of his earnings upward without ever meeting the boss who ultimately benefited. The system was strongest when it felt unavoidable. That is important to understand because popular culture often focuses on dramatic murders, expensive suits, black cars, nightclubs, and secret meetings. Those things existed, but they were not the main source of Mafia power. The real strength of the five families came from control over routine activity. Work schedules, deliveries, permits, contracts, loans, hiring, waste removal, concrete, clothing, food, transportation. New York was too large for any criminal organisation to control completely. The five families never owned the entire city in the literal sense. Federal agencies, local police, rival gangs, honest businesses, reformers, prosecutors, journalists and ordinary citizens always existed outside their influence. Even at the height of Mafia power, the city remained too complicated to belong to one group. But control did not have to be complete to be effective. Imagine owning a small business and discovering that your deliveries are repeatedly delayed. Your employees begin receiving threats, inspectors suddenly find violations, a union dispute appears without warning. Then a calm man arrives and explains that these problems can be resolved for a monthly payment. Nothing has to be said directly. The message is clear. Or imagine being a construction contractor bidding on a major project. You can submit the lowest price, hire skilled workers, and meet every legal requirement. Yet if you do not purchase materials through the approved companies, your concrete may not arrive, your trucks may be stopped, your labour costs may suddenly increase, deadlines may pass, penalties may accumulate, and your reputation may collapse. The Mafia did not need to own your company. It only needed to control the points where your company depended on the city around it. This kind of influence grew gradually. It was not announced. There was no morning when New Yorkers opened the newspaper and learned that 5 criminal families had taken control. The expansion happened industry by industry and neighbourhood by neighbourhood. It relied on fear, but also on convenience, corruption, personal loyalty, political exchange, and the willingness of legitimate people to make profitable compromises. Some business owners paid because they were threatened. Others paid because mafia connections offered advantages. A mob-controlled union could create trouble for competitors. A corrupt official could make permits appear faster. Stolen goods could be purchased cheaply. Illegal loans could be obtained without paperwork. Gambling profits could be hidden inside legitimate accounts. This was one of the most dangerous features of the system. It did not survive only because people feared it. It survived because enough people found ways to benefit from it. By the 1940s and 1950s, the five families had become permanent forces in New York's criminal economy. Their leaders changed, their alliances shifted, and their internal disputes continued, but the structure endured. The names attached to the families would become famous: Bonanno, Colombo, Gambino, Genovese, and Lucchese. Each had its own history, personalities, territories, and internal culture. Each wanted profit and influence. Each needed to appear strong without creating so much chaos that the entire system attracted overwhelming attention. For an ordinary New Yorker, most of this remained invisible. You could ride the subway to work, buy bread, send clothing to a dry cleaner, hire a contractor, eat dinner in a restaurant, and return home without seeing a single obvious crime. Yet somewhere along the chain of those ordinary activities, money might have passed through a business influenced by one of the families. The delivery truck, the building materials, the garment shop, the waste company, the union local, or the restaurant supplier might all exist within networks that reached upward toward men whose names rarely appeared on official documents. The city continued to look normal because normality was useful. A criminal empire cannot operate for long if every street resembles a battlefield. It needs banks, businesses, workers, politicians, lawyers, and customers. It needs the trains to run, the ships to unload, and the construction projects to continue. It does not replace the ordinary city. It attaches itself to the ordinary city and takes a percentage. That was the world the five families learned to build. To understand how they reached that level, we need to return to the neighbourhoods where their earliest members lived, to the crowded tenements and street markets of Italian New York, to the protection rackets that existed before Prohibition, and to the conditions that allowed small groups of violent men to become organised institutions. The criminal empire did not begin in a boardroom. It began on streets where authority was uncertain, opportunity was limited, and silence could be worth more than a witness statement. Long before the five families controlled unions, construction contracts, gambling rooms, trucking routes, and entire sections of New York's economy, there were crowded streets where power belonged to whoever could provide it fastest. To understand how the Mafia took root in New York, we need to leave behind the polished offices and expensive restaurants that would come later. We need to return to the final decades of the 19th century, when hundreds of thousands of Italian immigrants were arriving in a city that was expanding faster than its institutions could manage. Between 1880 and the beginning of the First World War, millions of Italians entered the United States. Many came from southern Italy and Sicily, regions shaped by poverty, political upheaval, limited land ownership, and a long history of distrust toward distant government authorities. They did not arrive as members of criminal organizations. Most came because they needed work and believed that America offered a chance to earn money, support relatives, purchase land, or build a future that had been impossible at home. Some intended to stay permanently. Others planned to work for several years and then return to Italy with their savings. They arrived through New York Harbour carrying clothing, family documents, religious objects, food for the journey, and the addresses of relatives or acquaintances who had reached the city before them. After passing through immigration processing, many entered neighbourhoods that were already crowded beyond anything they had known. Mulberry Street, Elizabeth Street, Mott Street, and the surrounding blocks became closely associated with Italian life in Manhattan. Smaller Italian communities also developed in East Harlem, Brooklyn, the Bronx, and other parts of the city. The neighborhood, later called Little Italy, was not one unified community. People from Sicily, Naples, Calabria, Campania, Basilicata, and other regions often settled near others from the same village or province. They spoke different dialects. Their customs varied. Some did not even think of themselves primarily as Italian. Italy had become a unified country only in 1861, and regional identity remained strong. A man from Palermo might have felt little immediate connection to a family from Naples. A Calabrian labourer might understand only part of the dialect spoken by someone from northern Italy. The idea of one large Italian-American community developed gradually. At first, many immigrants organised their lives around family, village connections, neighbourhood associations, churches, and mutual aid societies. These connections were essential because New York offered little protection to newcomers who had no money, spoke limited English, and did not understand the legal or political system. A newly arrived worker needed someone to tell him where jobs were available. He needed help finding a room, often in an apartment already occupied by several relatives or boarders. He needed to know which contractor was hiring men for roadwork, construction, garbage removal, railroad maintenance, or excavation. If he became sick or injured, he needed relatives and neighbours because there was no government program prepared to replace his wages. The streets were full of employment agents, landlords, merchants, political organisers, priests, labour contractors, and men who claimed they could solve problems. Some genuinely helped. Others discovered that desperation could be turned into profit. A labour contractor known as a padrone might arrange work for newly arrived immigrants. The word meant patron or master, and the padrone system could provide real opportunities. It could also become deeply exploitative. A padrone might control access to jobs, deduct fees from wages, rent overcrowded rooms to workers, or demand loyalty in exchange for continued employment. Political machines operated in a similar space between assistance and control. Tammany Hall, the Democratic political organisation that dominated much of New York politics, understood that immigrants needed practical help more urgently than they needed speeches about civic reform. A local political representative might assist a family facing eviction, help someone deal with the police, arrange a municipal job, or provide food during a difficult winter. In return, the political machine expected votes, loyalty, and silence. This did not mean every local politician was a criminal or every act of assistance was corrupt. It meant that formal government and personal favour were often mixed together. People learned that problems were solved through relationships. A man who knew the right police officer, ward leader, contractor, or judge could accomplish more than someone who simply believed the rules would protect him. Criminal groups developed inside this environment. The earliest Italian criminal networks in New York were not yet the Mafia that would later be recognised across the country. They were smaller, less stable, and usually tied to particular neighbourhoods or personal alliances. Some specialised in gambling, others committed theft, robbery, kidnapping, counterfeiting, or extortion. Extortion became one of the most feared crimes in Italian neighbourhoods because it relied on the victim's isolation. A shopkeeper might receive a letter demanding $100, an enormous amount for a small business owner at the time. The letter might warn that his store would be burned if he refused. It could threaten his children or describe the route his wife walked each morning. Sometimes the message included a drawing of a knife, pistol, skull, coffin, or black hand. Newspapers began referring to these crimes as the work of the Black Hand. The name created the impression that a single secret organisation had spread across Italian America. In reality, Black Hand extortion was a method rather than one unified group. Different criminals used similar symbols and threats because the reputation of the Black Hand made victims more afraid. A man receiving such a letter could not know whether it came from two local thieves or a larger organisation capable of reaching him anywhere in the city. That uncertainty was part of the weapon. The extortionist did not need to attack every person who refused payment. He only needed the neighbourhood to believe that refusal was dangerous. One bombing, kidnapping, or murder could frighten dozens of other victims into paying quietly. Italian business owners were especially vulnerable because many distrusted the police or feared that reporting the threat would make matters worse. Some officers did not speak Italian. Others treated immigrant victims with contempt. Corruption within the police department meant that information could sometimes reach the criminals themselves. There was also the cultural pressure of omertà, a term later heavily associated with the Mafia's code of silence. The reality was more complicated than the romantic version presented in films. Silence did not always come from loyalty to criminals or an inherited Sicilian tradition. It often came from fear, practical experience, and the belief that authorities could not be trusted. A witness who identified an extortionist might still have to live on the same street after the trial. His children might attend school near the criminal's relatives. His business could be attacked. If the accused man was released, the witness would face the consequences personally. Police protection was temporary. The neighbourhood was permanent. One of the most famous opponents of Blackhand crime was Joseph Petrosino, an Italian-born New York police officer who understood both the language and the communities in which the extortionists operated. Petrosino joined the New York Police Department in the 1880s and became known for investigating Italian criminal networks at a time when many officers showed little interest in distinguishing criminals from the wider immigrant population. He recognised that treating every Italian immigrant as suspicious only helped the criminals. Cooperation required trust. Petrosino used informants, undercover work, surveillance, and his knowledge of dialects and regional customs. He investigated extortionists, counterfeiters, and men with criminal records in Italy who had continued their activities in the United States. His work made him famous, but it also made him a target. In 1909, Petrosino travelled to Sicily on a secret mission to gather information that could be used to deport criminals from the United States. Details of the trip became known, possibly through a leak. On the evening of March 12th, Petrosino was shot and killed in Palermo. His murder had enormous symbolic importance. Thousands attended memorial events in New York. Italian immigrants who had often been portrayed as naturally sympathetic to criminals publicly mourned a police officer who had defended their communities from extortion. Petrosino's death also revealed the international connections that could exist between criminals in Sicily and the United States. Those connections were real, but they should not be exaggerated. The American Mafia was not simply a Sicilian organization transported intact across the Atlantic. It developed in response to American conditions, American markets, American politics, and the enormous opportunities created by American cities. Sicilian traditions influenced its language, rituals, and structure. New York shaped its business model. At the beginning of the 20th century, Italian gangs operated alongside many other criminal groups. Irish gangs had long been part of New York's underworld. Jewish gangs became prominent in gambling, labour racketeering, theft, and later bootlegging. Street gangs formed in neighbourhoods where young men faced limited employment, unstable families, discrimination, and daily violence. The Lower East Side was one of the most densely populated places in the world. Thousands of people lived in tenement buildings with inadequate ventilation, limited sanitation, and little privacy. Entire families occupied a few rooms. Boarders were taken in to help pay rent. Children slept several to a bed or on improvised mattresses. The streets became extensions of the home. Children played there. Merchants sold goods from carts. Neighbours exchanged news. Workers searched for employment. Arguments, celebrations, funerals, religious processions, and political rallies all unfolded in public. For boys growing up in these neighbourhoods, the street provided education of another kind. They learned which corners belonged to which groups. They learned how to avoid police officers, how to spot an easy target, how to sell stolen goods, and how to earn small amounts of money carrying messages or watching for danger. A boy might begin by stealing food, coal, clothing, or packages from delivery carts. He might join friends in robbing a drunk or breaking into a warehouse. Most poor children did not become criminals. That distinction matters. Poverty created vulnerability, not destiny. Millions of children grew up in the same neighbourhoods and became workers, shopkeepers, teachers, soldiers, union organisers, parents and professionals. For a small number, however, gangs offered something the legal economy did not: status, protection, quick money, and a clear path upward. A factory job could mean long hours, low pay, dangerous machinery, and no guarantee of advancement. A gang offered immediate belonging. An older criminal could provide a young man with clothing, meals, spending money, and the respect that came from being feared. The early steps rarely looked like the beginning of a criminal career. A teenager might be paid to deliver an envelope without asking what it contained. He might stand outside a gambling room and whistle if a police officer approached. He might collect a small debt from someone unlikely to resist. Each task tested reliability. Could he remain silent? Would he keep the money he had been given? Would he panic when questioned? Could he use violence if ordered? Did he understand that personal feelings mattered less than loyalty to the group? Criminal organisations did not recruit through formal applications. They observed behaviour. A useful young man received more responsibility. A careless one was ignored, beaten, arrested, or killed. Gambling provided steady income for many of these groups. Illegal lotteries, card games, dice games, and betting operations could be run in apartments, back rooms, basements, and social clubs. The amounts wagered by individual customers might be small, but the total revenue across a crowded neighbourhood could be considerable. The Italian lottery, often called the numbers game, became especially popular. Players selected numbers and placed small bets through local agents. The winning number might be connected to a financial total, a racing result, or another figure that appeared difficult to manipulate. A neighbourhood numbers operation required collectors, record keepers, money handlers, and protection. It created an organised chain of responsibility. It also brought criminals into regular contact with ordinary residents who might otherwise avoid them. Loan sharking developed beside gambling because people who lost money often wanted to continue betting, and working families frequently needed emergency cash. Banks were unlikely to lend small sums to poor labourers with no property or formal credit history. A neighbourhood lender could provide money immediately. The interest was high, and failure to pay could lead to violence. Yet the relationship was not always experienced as simple victimization. A borrower might resent the terms but still return because no legal institution would help him. A local criminal could present himself as more accessible than a bank, more responsive than the government, and more effective than the police. This ability to combine exploitation with service became central to Mafia power. The successful neighbourhood criminal did not want to be seen only as a thief. He wanted to be viewed as a man who could arrange things. He could recover stolen property, settle an argument, find work for a relative, lend money, influence a landlord, or persuade someone to leave a business alone. Of course, the problems he solved were often created by the same criminal system that gave him authority. A shopkeeper who paid for protection might genuinely experience fewer robberies because local thieves had been warned to avoid him. The arrangement worked. That was what made it dangerous. The criminal was not selling an imaginary service. He was selling safety from a threat that existed because men like him controlled the neighbourhood. During these early years, several groups began to move beyond street-level activity. One of the most influential was associated with Giuseppe Morello. Morello, a Sicilian immigrant, became a leading figure in a criminal organisation operating in East Harlem and Lower Manhattan. His group was involved in counterfeiting, extortion, and other rackets. The organisation included men whose names would become important in the development of New York's Mafia, including members of the Morello and Terranova families. Counterfeiting demanded more skill and coordination than ordinary street theft. False currency had to be printed, transported, and distributed without attracting immediate detection. The operation required trusted participants and connections beyond a single block. Federal agents eventually investigated the Morello organization, and convictions weakened its leadership. But the network did not disappear. Other men took control, factions changed, and relationships survived imprisonment. This pattern would repeat throughout Mafia history. Arresting a leader could disrupt an organization, but if the system beneath him remained intact, another leader would eventually take his place. By the 1910s, New York's Italian underworld included multiple factions. Some were based in East Harlem, others operated in Brooklyn or Lower Manhattan. Their alliances were influenced by family relationships, Sicilian hometown connections, and business interests. The groups competed, but they also communicated. A dispute over gambling territory could produce violence. A profitable opportunity could produce cooperation. There was no stable central authority capable of settling every disagreement. This instability placed limits on growth. A gang could collect money from local businesses, but expansion into another neighborhood risked war. A leader could build a reputation, but his death might divide his followers. Personal loyalty was powerful, yet it could not easily manage a criminal economy spread across a large city. The streets were creating experienced criminals, but not yet a criminal empire. Then came the First World War, followed by social unrest, labor conflict, political fear, and rapid economic change. New York's population continued to grow. Automobiles and trucks changed transportation. Telephone networks made communication faster. Warehouses, rail lines, docks, and roads connected the city to national markets. Crime was becoming easier to organize across greater distances. A stolen shipment could be transported to another state. Gambling information could travel by telephone. Bribes could be distributed through political contacts. Criminals who understood logistics had an advantage over men who relied only on intimidation. The younger generation was watching. Among them were men such as Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, Vito Genovese, Benjamin Siegel, Tommy Lucchese, and others who would later help transform organized crime. They grew up in different neighborhoods and came from different backgrounds, but they shared a practical understanding of the city. They knew that ethnic loyalty could be useful, but profit could be more useful. They understood that political influence was often worth more than street reputation. They saw that the man who controlled a supply chain could earn more than the man who committed a robbery. They also learned from the failures of the older gang leaders. Too much violence brought police attention. Unnecessary feuds damaged business. Leaders who demanded respect without distributing money created enemies within their own organizations. A criminal group needed fear, but it also needed administration. Before Prohibition, these lessons were still developing. There was money in gambling, extortion, prostitution, theft, labor racketeering, and illegal lending, but none of these activities offered the enormous national market that alcohol would soon provide. The streets had produced the men, the methods, and the relationships. They had taught criminals how to recruit, collect, threaten, bribe, and remain silent. Political machines had demonstrated how loyalty could be exchanged for services. Labour contractors had shown how control over jobs could become power. Blackhand extortionists had shown how fear could travel farther than violence itself. Everything needed for a larger organisation was already present except the opportunity large enough to bring it together. That opportunity arrived when the federal government attempted to remove alcohol from American life. The decision seemed to be about morality, public health, family stability, and social order. In New York, it created a market worth millions of dollars and handed it directly to anyone capable of supplying what the public still wanted. Small gangs that had once fought over street corners would soon control fleets of trucks, warehouses, breweries, political contacts, and armed crews. The old neighborhood rackets did not disappear. They became the foundation beneath something larger. The extortion collector became a business representative. The street lookout became an armed guard. The local gang leader became a distributor. The corrupt police contact became part of a citywide protection system. New York had already created the conditions in which organised crime could survive. Prohibition would provide the money that allowed it to rule. Prohibition gave New York's criminal groups more money than they had ever handled before, but money did not make the underworld orderly. It made the rivalries larger, the weapons easier to obtain, and the cost of losing far more serious. By the late 1920s, illegal alcohol had changed the scale of organised crime. Trucks moved liquor from hidden breweries, warehouses, coastal landing points, and Canadian supply routes into the city. Speakeasies purchased regular deliveries. Politicians, police officers, customs officials, and inspectors accepted bribes to ignore what was happening. Criminal organisations that had once depended on neighbourhood extortion or small gambling operations now handled businesses worth millions of dollars. The men in charge had begun as local bosses, but some were trying to govern networks that reached across boroughs and state lines. Their organisations included drivers, guards, accountants, bartenders, bookmakers, thieves, killers, labour contacts, and legitimate businessmen. A dispute between two leaders no longer affected only a few streets. It could interfere with hundreds of employees and dozens of profitable operations. New York's Italian underworld was divided among several factions. Alliances changed often, and authority was based as much on personal reputation as on any formal structure. Some groups had roots in East Harlem and Lower Manhattan. Others were concentrated in Brooklyn. Many of their leaders had come from Sicily, and connections to particular towns or provinces still mattered. Two men came to dominate this unstable world. The first was Giuseppe Masseria, known widely as Joe Masseria or Joe the Boss. He was born in Sicily and had established himself in New York through gambling, extortion, bootlegging, and his ability to absorb smaller groups into his organisation. Masseria was physically large, publicly confident, and experienced in the violent politics of the underworld. He had survived attempts on his life, which strengthened his reputation. In one often repeated account, gunmen fired at him from close range and left him with bullet holes in his clothing, but no serious wounds. Whether every detail was remembered accurately mattered less than the conclusion drawn by other criminals. Joe the Boss appeared difficult to kill. Masseria understood the old style of Mafia leadership. A boss demonstrated strength, demanded tribute, and expected personal loyalty. Men beneath him were protected as long as they remained useful and obedient. Rival leaders could be pressured, absorbed, or removed. His organisation included several younger criminals who would later become major figures in American organised crime. Lucky Luciano worked under Masseria. So did Vito Genovese and Frank Costello. Men connected to Gaetano Reina, another powerful New York leader, were also drawn into Masseria's network. The second major figure was Salvatore Maranzano. Maranzano had arrived in the United States from Castellammare del Golfo, a town in western Sicily with strong family and criminal connections extending into American cities. He was educated by the standards of many gang leaders, had reportedly studied for the priesthood in his youth, and possessed a strong interest in Roman military history. He was controlled in conversation, formal in manner, and careful about ceremony. Where Masseria appeared like a powerful street boss, Maranzano presented himself as a strategist. He organised men through disciplined chains of authority and drew support from Sicilians who resented Masseria's growing control. Behind Maranzano stood another important figure, though he did not spend the entire conflict openly directing events in New York. Stefano Magaddino, a Castellammarese leader based in Buffalo, maintained connections with men from the same Sicilian region. These relationships gave Maranzano support beyond one neighbourhood and reminded everyone that New York's underworld was linked to criminal groups in other American cities. The struggle between Masseria and Maranzano became known as the Castellammarese War. The name makes the conflict sound more organised than it was. There were no uniforms, public declarations, or clearly marked battlefields. The fighting took place through ambushes, disappearances, restaurant shootings, betrayals, and sudden changes in allegiance. Men continued operating gambling rooms, liquor routes, and legitimate businesses while wondering whether someone they trusted had already agreed to kill them. The war developed from several overlapping disputes. Mafia wanted to extend his authority over Italian criminal groups throughout New York. Castellamarie's factions resisted. Control of bootlegging, gambling, protection, and labour rackets added financial pressure. Personal rivalries became connected to larger questions about who had the right to command. There was also a generational conflict within the underworld. Older Sicilian bosses were sometimes described by younger criminals as moustache Petes. The term referred to men who had brought older customs and regional loyalties from Sicily. It was often used dismissively by younger gangsters who believed those traditions limited business. The division was not absolute. Older bosses could be flexible, and younger men were capable of intense ethnic and family loyalty. Still, the younger generation was more willing to work openly with Jewish, Irish, and other non-Italian criminals. Lucky Luciano's close relationship with Meyer Lansky represented this approach. Luciano cared less about where a profitable partner's parents had been born than whether that partner could be trusted to deliver results. Bootlegging had encouraged these partnerships. Alcohol moved through international and interstate networks. A shipment might involve Canadian suppliers, Irish dock workers, Jewish financiers, Italian distributors, corrupt police officers, and nightclub owners from several backgrounds. Refusing to cooperate outside one ethnic group meant surrendering profitable opportunities. To Luciano and his allies, the war between Mafia and Maranzano was wasteful. Both leaders claimed to represent order, yet their competition disrupted business and forced younger men to choose sides in a dispute that offered them little long-term benefit. The danger increased in February 1930 when Gaetano Reina was shot and killed. Reina controlled an important organisation in the Bronx and had influence over ice distribution. Before electric refrigeration became common, households and businesses depended on regular deliveries of ice. Control over that trade could produce both legitimate revenue and opportunities for extortion. Reina had been connected to Mafia, but relations between them had deteriorated. He was reportedly considering a shift toward Maranzano's side. His murder removed a potential rival and allowed Mafia to interfere in the leadership of Reina's organisation. Mafia supported Joseph Pinzolo as Reina's replacement. The decision angered influential members of Reina's group, including Gaetano Galliano and Tommy Lucchesi. They did not view Pinzolo as their natural leader. To them, he was an outsider imposed by Mafia to keep their operations under control. Pinzolo did not remain in power for long. In September 1930, he was murdered inside an office building near Times Square. His death showed that Mafia could appoint a leader, but could not force every crew to accept him. The violence continued. Men associated with both sides were killed in rapid succession. Peter Morello, a senior figure aligned with Mafia, was shot in his East Harlem office. Other murders followed. Each death weakened one faction, strengthened another, or created a vacancy that several men wanted to fill. The public saw bodies and newspaper reports. The criminals saw organisational charts changing in real time. A murder could transfer control of gambling locations, liquor customers, union relationships, and political contacts. It could also provoke retaliation that destroyed the value of whatever had been gained. This was why selecting the target, location, and timing required careful thought. Killing a rival in public sent a message, but it also brought police attention. Making a man disappear created uncertainty, but uncertainty could make his followers more dangerous. A failed assassination was worse than no attempt at all, because it revealed intention without removing the enemy. Both factions depended on informants. A man's schedule, restaurant habits, sleeping arrangements, and personal relationships could determine whether he survived. Bodyguards offered protection only if they remained loyal. Drivers knew too much. Secretaries heard conversations. Bartenders watched meetings take place. Every ordinary habit became a possible weakness. Some leaders changed cars frequently. Others avoided predictable routines. Meetings were arranged through intermediaries. Sensitive information was divided so that few people knew the entire plan. These methods later became associated with sophisticated organised crime, but during the Castellammari's War they developed under immediate pressure. Lucky Luciano occupied a dangerous position. He was formally associated with Masseria, yet he maintained relationships across the underworld and increasingly believed that neither Masseria nor Maranzano should control the future. Luciano and other younger criminals wanted the war to end, but ending it required removing the men whose authority depended on continuing it. Luciano's later accounts of these events helped shape the popular story. As with many Mafia narratives, exact details are difficult to separate from exaggeration, selective memory, and legend. Participants had reasons to make themselves appear more important, more intelligent, or less personally responsible for murder. What is clear is that Luciano and his allies played a central role in the betrayal of Masseria. By early 1931, Masseria's position had weakened. Several important men had been killed or had changed allegiance. Maranzano's faction had proven more resilient than expected. The war was expensive, and Masseria could no longer guarantee that the younger men beneath him would remain loyal. On April 15th, 1931, Masseria went to a restaurant called Nuova Villa Tamaro on Coney Island. The setting was not unusual. Restaurants provided familiar meeting places where men could eat, talk, and appear to be conducting ordinary business. Masseria sat with Luciano and possibly several others. According to the most famous version of the story, they played cards after the meal. At some point Luciano left the table, often said to have gone to the restroom. Gunmen entered the restaurant and opened fire on Masseria. He was struck repeatedly and died at the scene. Photographs of his body appeared in newspapers. One showed Masseria lying on the floor with an ace of spades near his hand. The image became one of the most famous visual symbols of the gang era. It seemed almost too perfect, as though the death had been arranged for a film. The card may simply have fallen during the shooting, or been moved afterward, but the photograph helped turn a criminal assassination into legend. With Masseria dead, the Castellammari's War appeared to be over. Maranzano had won. He moved quickly to formalise his victory. Maranzano summoned leading Italian criminals to a meeting and reorganised New York's major groups. He divided them into 5 organisations. Each would have its own boss and internal hierarchy. These groups became the foundation of the organisations later known as the 5 families. The names used today were not immediately attached to them. Families would eventually be identified by the names of later bosses: Bonanno, Colombo, Gambino, Genovese, and Lucchese. In 1931, leadership and labels were still changing. One organisation was led by Maranzano himself. Another was associated with Luciano. Gaetano Galliano controlled the group that had grown from Reina's organisation. Vincent Mangano led another major faction. Joseph Profassi headed the 5th. Together, these groups represented the most powerful Italian criminal organisations in New York. Maranzano structured them according to a hierarchy that clarified responsibility. At the top was the boss. Directly beneath him stood the underboss, who helped manage daily operations and could act in the boss's place. A consigliere served as an advisor and mediator. Captains, later commonly called capos, supervised crews. Soldiers carried out the organisation's regular criminal work. Associates cooperated with the family but were not necessarily formal members. This arrangement was not entirely invented by Maranzano. Elements of it had existed in Sicilian criminal organisations and American groups before 1931. His contribution was to impose a clearer citywide order after the war. The structure solved several practical problems. A boss could not personally supervise hundreds of men. Captains allowed orders and money to move through controlled layers. A soldier usually reported to his captain rather than approaching the boss directly. This reduced confusion and protected senior leaders from street-level crimes. If a bookmaker was arrested, he might know the soldier who collected money from him. The soldier knew his captain. The captain might communicate with higher leadership through another intermediary. The boss could claim distance from the illegal activity. The hierarchy also created a system for distributing profit. Money moved upward, protection moved downward. A soldier kept part of what he earned and passed a share to his captain. The captain passed money to senior leadership. In exchange, membership offered access to business opportunities, influence, and the reputation of the family. Maranzano explained the structure through language drawn from the Roman military. He admired Julius Caesar and reportedly kept books about the Roman Empire in his office. This interest suited his view of criminal authority. He did not see himself merely as another neighborhood boss. He saw himself as the organizer of a disciplined system. That belief led him to make the same mistake Masseria had made. Maranzano declared himself capo di tutti capi, the boss of all bosses. The title placed him above the heads of the 5 organizations. Rather than creating a balance among them, he claimed the right to supervise everyone. He could settle disputes, demand payments, and interfere in family affairs. For Luciano and the younger leaders, this was not the new system they had wanted. They had helped remove Masseria because one man's personal rule had become an obstacle. Maranzano had ended the war only to place himself in the same position. He was also becoming suspicious of Luciano. Maranzano understood that the younger man had betrayed Masseria and could betray him as well. Luciano's relationships with Lansky, Costello, Genovese, and other ambitious criminals made him especially dangerous. He had access to men from outside traditional Sicilian circles and could build alliances Maranzano did not fully control. According to later accounts, Maranzano decided to have Luciano and Vito Genovese killed. He allegedly hired Vincent Mad Dog Coll, an Irish-American gunman known for extreme violence, to carry out the murders. Whether every element of this plot unfolded exactly as later described is uncertain. The central fact is not. Luciano's faction believed Maranzano intended to eliminate them, and they acted first. On September 10th, 1931, several men entered Maranzano's office in the New York Central building on Park Avenue. They posed as government agents. The disguise gave them an important advantage. Maranzano's guards were less likely to begin shooting at men they believed were federal investigators. The attackers disarmed staff members and entered the inner office. Maranzano was stabbed and shot. The men escaped before police understood what had happened. His death came less than 5 months after Masseria's murder. The 2 older leaders who had fought to control New York were both gone. Neither had been defeated in a direct battle. Each had been betrayed by men close enough to know when he would be vulnerable. Later Mafia stories claim that Luciano ordered a nationwide purge of older Sicilian bosses on the same day, sometimes called the Night of the Sicilian Vespers. According to this version, dozens of traditional leaders were murdered across the United States within hours. The dramatic nationwide massacre is probably exaggerated. Several gangland killings occurred around that period, but there is little reliable evidence for one perfectly coordinated purge on the scale later described. The story survived because it expressed a broader truth. Power was passing from older bosses to a younger generation that wanted a different kind of organisation. Luciano did not take Maranzano's title. There would be no new boss of all bosses, at least not officially. Luciano understood that claiming absolute authority would encourage the other leaders to unite against him. A man visibly standing above everyone else also became the most obvious target for investigators and rivals. Instead, Luciano helped establish a governing council known as the Commission. The Commission included the bosses of New York's 5 major families and leaders from other important American mafia organizations. Its purpose was not to supervise every crime or make every local decision. Each family retained authority over its own operations. The Commission handled matters that affected multiple organizations. It could recognise new bosses, approve important territorial changes, resolve disputes, and consider murders likely to cause wider conflict. It provided a place for leaders to negotiate before violence damaged everyone's profits. Luciano's system did not remove ambition, resentment, or betrayal. It gave those forces procedures. This was the major change created by the war. Before 1931, New York's Italian underworld had consisted of competing networks whose boundaries were often unclear. After the deaths of Masseria and Maranzano, 5 major organizations operated with recognizable leadership, internal ranks, and a shared method for managing disputes. The 5 families were not identical. Their territories overlapped, and their influence changed over time. Some were stronger in Manhattan, others in Brooklyn, the Bronx, Queens, or nearby regions. Different families developed particular influence in docks, garment businesses, construction, trucking, gambling, unions, and other rackets. They competed for money, but they now had a reason to protect the larger system. Open warfare was bad for business. It frightened customers, disrupted collections, encouraged informants, and forced police departments to respond publicly. A quiet arrangement could remain profitable for years. A body on the pavement demanded attention. Violence did not disappear. It became more selective. Permission was often required before a formally inducted member of another family could be killed. Unauthorized murder risked retaliation and punishment. Leaders preferred to isolate a target, establish a justification, and ensure that removing him would not produce a larger conflict. The Mafia's famous rules were never followed perfectly. They were violated whenever powerful men believed they could escape the consequences. Still, the existence of rules distinguished the emerging families from ordinary street gangs. A street gang might collapse when its leader died. The family structure was meant to survive succession. When a boss was imprisoned or killed, an underboss, acting boss, or group of captains could continue operations. Crews retained their gambling customers, loan accounts, union contacts, and political relationships. Revenue did not have to stop while leadership changed. This continuity made the families durable. It also made them difficult for law enforcement to understand. Police could arrest a killer without seeing the organization that ordered the murder. They could close one gambling room while dozens of others continued operating. They could prosecute a corrupt union official without proving that money had moved through several intermediaries to a family boss. The senior leaders learned to avoid direct involvement in crimes that could be easily prosecuted. They spoke indirectly. An order might be phrased as a suggestion. A murder could be described as taking care of a problem. Money was counted behind closed doors without written records. Membership depended on silence, but it also depended on shared responsibility. A man who participated in crimes with others became dangerous if he cooperated with the authorities. The organization offered protection while holding evidence of his guilt. By the end of 1931, the outlines of the new criminal order were visible to the men inside it, though not yet to most of the public. New Yorkers knew gangsters existed. Newspapers reported bootlegging murders and printed photographs of dead bosses. Names such as Luciano appeared in police files and courtrooms. Yet the idea of a permanent national mafia governed through formal families remained unclear to many officials. Some law enforcement leaders continued to describe organised crime as disconnected local activity. The criminals benefited from that misunderstanding. Their strongest defence was not only bribery or fear, it was the public belief that no unified system existed. The war had created that system through bloodshed, but the men who inherited it did not want to remain at war. They wanted businesses that produced money every week. They wanted influence that could be passed to trusted successors. They wanted relationships with politicians, union officials, judges, police officers, and legitimate companies. They wanted an empire that functioned quietly enough to be mistaken for ordinary commerce. The street bosses had become administrators. Their soldiers still carried guns, but the future would depend just as heavily on contracts, payrolls, shipping schedules, construction materials and control over labour. With the boundaries of the 5 families established and the commission available to manage their disputes, they could begin attaching themselves to the daily machinery of New York. The next stage would not be fought mainly in restaurants or on sidewalks. It would unfold on the docks, inside union halls, at construction sites, in garment factories, and behind the counters of businesses that appeared completely legitimate. The 5 families had survived the war that created them. Now they had to make the new arrangement profitable. During Prohibition, large sums of money had come from illegal alcohol. That business required speed, armed protection, and constant bribery. Trucks had to move at night. Warehouses could be raided. Rival gangs could steal entire shipments. Police officers could accept payment one week and make arrests the next. It was profitable, but it was unstable. When Prohibition ended in December 1933, Americans could legally purchase alcohol again. The Mafia did not disappear with the speakeasies. Its organizations had become too large, too experienced, and too closely connected to the city. They had spent more than a decade learning how to transport goods, hide money, corrupt officials, manage employees, and punish anyone who interfered with business. They had also discovered something more important than bootlegging. The best criminal operation was not always the one that appeared criminal. A gambling room could be raided. A truck carrying illegal liquor could be seized. A robbery produced money only once. Control over a legitimate industry could produce revenue every day while leaving the men at the top several steps away from any obvious crime. The 5 families began expanding further into businesses New Yorkers depended on but rarely thought about. They did not need to own every company or control every worker. They needed influence at the places where money, labour and goods moved through narrow points. The waterfront was one of the most valuable of those places. New York Harbor was among the busiest commercial centres in the world. Ships arrived carrying food, clothing, machinery, coffee, tobacco, metals, and countless other products. The cargo had to be unloaded, checked, stored, and transferred to trucks or railways. Thousands of longshoremen depended on the port for work. Shipping companies depended on the same men to keep cargo moving. Before the widespread use of modern shipping containers, loading and unloading a vessel required large numbers of workers. Cargo often passed through many hands. Crates and sacks were moved individually. Records were less precise than they would later become. A damaged package, an incorrect count, or an open warehouse door could create opportunities for theft. The hiring system made the docks especially vulnerable. Many longshoremen did not have guaranteed daily employment. They gathered at designated places and waited for hiring bosses to choose who would work. A man who offended the wrong person could be ignored. A worker who paid tribute, supported the correct union officer, or cooperated with criminals could receive better assignments. This practice became known as the shape-up. Men stood in groups while hiring bosses selected the day's workforce. The system gave enormous power to the people making those choices. A longshoreman with a family to support might arrive before dawn and still return home without earning anything. A union representative or hiring boss connected to organised crime did not need to threaten every worker directly. The possibility of losing work was enough. Men understood that complaints could result in fewer shifts, dangerous assignments, or complete exclusion. Criminal control on the waterfront went beyond hiring. Cargo could be stolen and sold through fences. Shipping companies could be pressured into making payments to prevent delays or damage. Union officials could demand bribes during contract negotiations. Employers might cooperate because paying one criminal group seemed cheaper than facing repeated work stoppages. The families did not invent every abuse that occurred on the docks. Corruption, theft, and unfair hiring had existed before Mafia involvement. Organised crime made those practices more systematic. It connected local intimidation to wider networks capable of moving stolen goods, bribing officials and enforcing agreements. Several New York Mafia organizations developed strong waterfront interests, particularly the group eventually known as the Gambino family. Albert Anastasia, who became one of its most powerful figures, had worked on the Brooklyn docks and built important relationships within the International Longshoremen's Association. His influence showed how a position that appeared local could become part of a much larger criminal system. The union itself represented legitimate workers and negotiated real concerns involving wages, hours, and safety. Mafia influence did not mean every official was corrupt or every member willingly cooperated. Many workers were caught inside institutions where honest representation existed beside fear, favouritism, and criminal control. This mixture made reform difficult. A worker could value his union while distrusting certain officers. An employer could oppose extortion while benefiting from a controlled labour force. A politician could condemn violence while relying on union support during an election. Each person saw only part of the arrangement, and many had practical reasons not to challenge it. By 1949, a series of newspaper reports called Crime on the Waterfront exposed corruption, extortion, racketeering, and organised crime influence in the Port of New York. Public investigations followed, and New York and New Jersey eventually created the Waterfront Commission in 1953 to regulate hiring and fight criminal control. The need for such an institution showed how deeply the problem had developed. The docks were only one part of the empire. The garment industry offered another route into the legal economy. New York's garment district employed enormous numbers of workers and included manufacturers, contractors, trucking firms, suppliers, designers, wholesalers, and retailers. Clothing production often passed through several companies before a finished item reached a store. One business cut the fabric, another sewed it. A separate company handled pressing, delivery, or storage. That complicated chain created many places where pressure could be applied. A contractor needed workers. A manufacturer needed deliveries to arrive on time. A retailer needed clothing before the selling season changed. A delay of several days could destroy the value of an entire order. Criminals who influenced unions, trucking routes, or local contractors could create delays and then offer to remove them. A company that refused to cooperate might face a sudden strike, repeated delivery problems, stolen merchandise, or damage to equipment. Again, the most effective threat was often indirect. A man did not need to enter an office carrying a gun. He could explain that labour peace required a payment. He could recommend a particular trucking company or supplier. He could suggest that a dispute would become easier if the business owner hired a certain relative. The language remained polite because everyone understood what could happen if the suggestion was ignored. Garment businesses were also useful for hiding money. Cash from gambling, loan sharking, or other crimes could be mixed with legitimate revenue. A criminal investor could hold a hidden interest in a factory or trucking company. Official ownership papers might list a relative, associate, or businessman with no criminal record. The families learned that ownership was not always necessary. Influence could be more flexible. Owning a company created documents, taxes, and legal responsibility. Controlling the person who owned it could provide many of the same benefits with less risk. A businessman who owed money, feared violence, or depended on union cooperation could be more useful than a formal mafia member. This principle spread across industries. Trucking was particularly important because almost everything entering or leaving New York had to be moved. Trucks carried food to markets, clothing to stores, waste away from buildings, and materials to construction sites. A trucking company connected to a family could receive contracts through intimidation or collusion. Competitors could be discouraged from bidding. Drivers could transport stolen goods alongside legal cargo. Control over transportation also connected separate rackets. Stolen merchandise from the waterfront needed to be moved and stored. Illegal gambling machines had to be delivered. Construction materials had to reach job sites. Restaurants and clubs required regular supplies. The families were building systems that supported one another. A gambling operation produced cash. A legitimate business helped hide it. A union contact protected the business. A political contact reduced the risk of inspection. A lawyer responded when someone was arrested. A loan shark provided money to a businessman, and the unpaid debt created influence over the company. This was not one enormous conspiracy in which every participant understood the entire design. It was a collection of relationships organised around the same families. The building trades became another major source of power. Construction in New York involved large contracts and strict deadlines. Developers depended on labourers, concrete suppliers, truck drivers, electricians, plumbers, carpenters, and inspectors. If one part of the process stopped, the entire project could lose money. The Mafia recognised the value of controlling the interruption. A family with influence over a union local could threaten a work stoppage. A supplier could refuse delivery. Trucks could arrive late. Equipment could be damaged. Inspectors could suddenly become interested in violations. The same family could then offer a solution. Some contractors paid to avoid trouble. Others entered cooperative arrangements and used mafia connections to obtain an advantage over honest competitors. A company protected by organised crime might know that rival bids would be discouraged. Its labour problems might disappear. Materials could be supplied at fixed prices agreed upon by a group of companies. This kind of arrangement is known as bid rigging. Companies that appear to compete secretly decide who will win a contract. The others submit deliberately higher bids to create the appearance of a fair process. The winning company may then pay part of the profit to criminal organisers or other participants. The public pays more, the chosen companies receive protected profits, and honest competitors are excluded. Decades later, prosecutors would demonstrate how the five families manipulated parts of New York's construction industry, particularly through control of unions and concrete contracts. The famous commission case of the 1980s revealed a system in which mafia leaders exercised influence over major concrete jobs. But the foundations of that power had been built much earlier, through relationships developed over years. Small construction projects could also produce steady income. A contractor renovating an apartment building might be told which company to hire for demolition or waste removal. A developer might pay for labour peace. A business owner opening a store could discover that one union claimed work another union had already completed. The dispute might be real, or it might be manufactured. Either way, delay cost money, and the person who could end the delay gained power. The mafia's role in labour unions was especially valuable because unions possessed legitimate authority. They could negotiate contracts, call strikes, collect dues, and influence elections. These powers existed to protect workers, but corrupt leaders could use them for private gain. A controlled union local provided several forms of income. Officials could steal from benefit funds. Employers could pay bribes in exchange for favourable contracts. Workers could be forced to surrender part of their wages. Jobs could be distributed to associates. Union resources could support political candidates or legitimate companies connected to the families. Pension and welfare funds eventually became especially attractive because they contained large pools of money. The people managing those funds decided where to invest and which loans to approve. A criminally influenced official could direct money toward businesses connected to organised crime. Not every arrangement involved obvious theft. A loan could be officially approved and properly documented while still serving criminal interests. The company receiving it might be controlled through hidden ownership. The project might employ mafia-approved contractors. The borrower might repay the loan while providing other benefits to the organisation. Legal form could conceal illegal purpose. The waste hauling industry provided another ideal structure. New York businesses needed regular garbage collection. Restaurants, stores, factories, and office buildings could not simply stop removing waste. Private companies competed for commercial customers, but organised crime helped create systems in which the competition was often false. A waste company might claim a particular customer as its property. Other companies understood that they were not supposed to offer a lower price. Routes could be divided, and business owners were left with little real choice. A customer who tried to switch companies might receive threats or discover that no competitor was willing to serve the address. Trucks could be damaged, drivers could be attacked, garbage could remain uncollected until the owner accepted the original company's terms. The service was real, but the market was controlled. This pattern appeared repeatedly throughout the Mafia economy. The families preferred industries that involved essential services, complex rules, cash payments, or limited competition. They looked for places where delay could be turned into pressure. Restaurants and nightclubs played a different but equally important role. A restaurant could provide legitimate revenue, employment for associates, and a private location for meetings. It could purchase food, alcohol, and equipment from connected suppliers. Cash from illegal activity could be mixed with daily receipts. Nightclubs created contact with entertainers, businessmen, politicians, police officers, and celebrities. A mob-connected owner could offer favours, free drinks, private rooms, and introductions. The club became a place where relationships were formed without appearing to be formal criminal meetings. The public might recognise that a particular nightclub had a dangerous reputation, and still consider that reputation part of its attraction. This was one reason the Mafia became culturally visible even while its structure remained hidden. Certain restaurants, clubs, and neighbourhoods developed associations with powerful men. People told stories about seeing a boss at a corner table, or watching politicians greet known gangsters. The families benefited from selective visibility. A feared reputation made extortion easier. A completely secret organisation could not intimidate anyone. At the same time, too much publicity invited prosecution. The ideal balance was to be known on the street, but difficult to prove in court. Senior mobsters often maintained an appearance of ordinary respectability. They lived in houses, raised families, attended weddings, visited social clubs, and invested in legal businesses. Some presented themselves as labour consultants, garment executives, food importers, construction managers, or property owners. They might have no obvious employment that explained their wealth, but wealth itself was not proof of a crime. The bosses also learned to distance themselves from street violence. Orders passed through layers. A boss spoke to an underboss or captain. The captain spoke to a soldier. The soldier might use an associate who was not formally inducted into the family. By the time a crime occurred, the person carrying it out may never have met the leader who benefited. This insulation was one of the five families' strongest defences. The FBI later described La Cosa Nostra as a collection of geographically organised families involved in illegal gambling, extortion, labour racketeering, political corruption, money laundering, and the infiltration of legitimate businesses. The combination of hierarchy and business infiltration allowed senior members to remain distant from individual crimes. Money moved upward through the same layers. A bookmaker accepted bets and paid a share to the person protecting the operation. That man paid a captain. The captain passed an agreed portion to the administration of the family. Similar payments came from loan sharks, card games, labour rackets, and legitimate businesses under family influence. The boss did not need to visit every operation. He needed reliable captains who could deliver money and keep their crews under control. Each crew functioned almost like a small business unit. A captain might supervise gambling, loan sharking, theft, and construction interests at the same time. His soldiers had their own associates and sources of income. Some were strong earners. Others were valued for violence, political connections, or the ability to manage disputes. The family provided a framework that joined these different activities together. Membership offered protection. A man officially recognised as part of a family could not be attacked casually without risking a larger conflict. His debts and disputes could be brought before senior leaders. His reputation gave him leverage in negotiations. In return, he owed obedience and money. The The arrangement encouraged criminals to think beyond individual crimes. A thief who stole everything available might damage a business that could have produced regular payments for years. A violent man who frightened customers could reduce profits. A soldier who drew unnecessary police attention became a liability. Discipline was not based on morality. It was based on preserving income. The most successful families understood that ordinary people were more valuable as customers, workers, borrowers, and business owners than as victims of random violence. Fear had to be controlled carefully. Too little fear weakened authority. Too much fear caused rebellion, publicity, or investigation. This was how the criminal empire became almost invisible. A restaurant owner paid more for waste collection but continued serving customers. A contractor added the cost of bribery to a public project. A dock worker surrendered part of his wages but remained employed. A shopper bought a coat without knowing that organised crime had influenced the trucking company that delivered it. The costs spread through the city. New Yorkers paid higher prices. Workers lost opportunities. Honest companies were prevented from competing. Taxpayers financed inflated contracts. Union members saw their institutions used against them. Most people could not identify where the extra cost had entered the system. They simply experienced the result. At street level, the family still operated gambling rooms and made illegal loans. Those traditional rackets remained profitable because they also created relationships. A gambler who owed money might own a store. A store owner might have access to trucks. A truck driver might know how cargo was secured at a warehouse. One debt could open the door to another business. Loan sharking was especially useful for taking control without formal ownership. A businessman unable to borrow from a bank might accept a high-interest loan from a Mafia lender. Payments were often due weekly. The interest could continue indefinitely until the principal was repaid, and missing a payment brought immediate pressure. When the borrower could no longer pay, the lender might demand access to the business. The company could be used to employ associates, store stolen goods, place fraudulent orders, or obtain credit from legitimate suppliers. The original owner remained on the paperwork while the criminal organisation extracted the value. This process became known as a bust-out when criminals deliberately drained a business. They used its credit to order goods, sold the merchandise for cash, avoided paying suppliers, and left the company to collapse. The owner could be ruined while the family moved on to another target. There was no need for a dramatic bank robbery. The legal credit system could be used to steal larger amounts with less immediate risk. Political corruption helped protect all of these operations. New York's government was too large for one organisation to control, but a few well-placed relationships could be extremely valuable. A police officer could warn of a raid, an inspector could ignore violations, a court employee could provide information, a politician could influence appointments or contracts. Payments did not always pass directly from a mobster to an official. Lawyers, businessmen, union representatives, and political intermediaries helped maintain distance. Favours could be more useful than cash. A family might help deliver votes in a local election. A union could support a candidate. A contractor could make a campaign contribution. In return, no one needed to make an explicit promise. The official simply remembered who had been helpful. The five families were not all powerful, and they did not control every union, business, or politician in New York. Their influence varied by period, industry, and neighborhood. Rival organizations competed with them, and many officials, workers, and business owners resisted. Their empire was powerful because it did not require total control. They needed enough influence to make resistance expensive. They needed enough honest commerce to hide criminal revenue. They needed enough corruption to receive warnings and favors. They needed enough fear to keep witnesses silent. Once those conditions existed, the system could maintain itself. A worker remained quiet because he needed his job. A businessman paid because his competitors were paying. A politician accepted support because refusing it might help an opponent. A police officer looked away because other officers were already doing the same. Each individual decision appeared small. Together they created an environment in which the families could operate for decades. By the middle of the 20th century, the Mafia was no longer located only in gambling rooms and neighbourhood social clubs. It was present wherever legitimate authority could be converted into private profit. The men at the top did not spend every day planning murders. Much of their time involved managing people, resolving disputes, approving partnerships, and deciding how money would be divided. A disagreement between two trucking companies could matter more financially than a street robbery. A union election could be more important than a gunfight. The five families had learned that the most valuable weapon in New York was control over routine. They controlled who worked, who delivered, who received contracts, who borrowed money, and who was allowed to compete. Violence remained behind the arrangement, but it did not have to be used often when everyone remembered that it was available. The empire remained hidden because most of its activities resembled business. Invoices were issued, trucks made deliveries, workers received wages, contracts were signed, restaurants opened for dinner, ships unloaded cargo. Only the price, the ownership, and the consequences of refusing had been quietly changed. Managing an empire of that size required more than intimidation. The five families needed procedures for cooperation, rules for membership, methods for dividing territory, and a way to prevent one dispute from becoming another war. The commission had been created for that purpose, but its role would grow as the families became more deeply connected to New York's economy. What had begun as a council of criminal leaders was developing into something that behaved like the board of directors of a national enterprise. Once the five families had secured their positions in New York, they faced a problem that every growing organization eventually encounters. A small group can be managed through personal relationships. A large one needs procedures. By the early 1930s, the leaders of the American Mafia were no longer supervising only neighborhood gambling rooms, protection payments, and local thieves. Their organizations handle liquor distribution, illegal betting, loans, labor rackets, political contacts, transportation networks, and investments in legitimate businesses. Their interest crossed neighborhood boundaries and extended beyond New York. A decision made in Manhattan could affect an operation in New Jersey. A dispute in Brooklyn could involve allies in Buffalo, Chicago, Philadelphia, or New Orleans. A murder committed without permission could begin a conflict between organizations that had profitable partnerships in several cities. The old method of government had been simple. The strongest boss issued orders, and everyone else obeyed until he became weak enough to remove. The Castellammaris War had shown why that arrangement could not last. Joe Masseria had tried to become the dominant figure in New York's Italian underworld. Salvatore Maranzano had defeated him, and then declared himself the boss of all bosses. Both men had been killed by people who believed that personal dictatorship threatened the larger business. Lucky Luciano and his allies wanted a system that did not depend on one man remaining feared forever. They did not want to eliminate hierarchy. They wanted to protect hierarchy from the ambitions of a single leader. The solution was the commission. It was not a government in the legal sense, and it did not operate from a permanent headquarters. There was no public office, official seal, or written constitution. It was a council of leading mafia bosses who met when major disputes or decisions affected more than one organization. New York's five bosses formed the center of the new arrangement. Important leaders from outside the city also participated. Chicago held particular influence because its organization controlled a major criminal market and had relationships extending throughout the Midwest and beyond. Other powerful families were represented according to the issue under discussion and the balance of power at the time. The exact membership changed as bosses died, retired, were imprisoned, or lost authority. The principle remained consistent. No one man would openly rule every family. The most important leaders would govern collectively. This did not make the Mafia democratic. Ordinary soldiers did not vote on policy. Associates did not elect bosses. The commission existed to protect the interests of senior criminals, not to give lower-ranking members a voice. Its decisions were based on power, profit, alliances, and the need to prevent uncontrolled conflict. It worked more like a board representing several closely connected companies. Each family managed its own daily affairs. Its boss appointed captains, approved new members, settled internal disputes, and collected a share of the organization's earnings. The commission usually did not interfere unless an issue threatened the stability of the wider system. A family could operate gambling businesses without requesting approval from every other boss. It could make loans, influence unions, and develop legitimate investments within its established areas. Problems arose when it moved into territory claimed by another family, or targeted someone whose death could provoke retaliation. The murder of a formerly inducted Mafia member was one of the most sensitive matters. Killing an associate outside the organization could still create trouble, but killing a made man attacked the authority of the family that protected him. If one family allowed another to murder its members without consequences, its reputation would collapse. Soldiers would question whether their leaders could defend them. Rival organizations would sense weakness. For that reason, a proposed murder might be discussed between bosses or brought before the commission. The rule did not come from respect for life. It came from concern about retaliation. A killing that solved a local problem could produce a citywide war. The commission allowed leaders to examine the wider cost before granting approval. They could decide whether the target had violated rules, whether his family accepted the punishment, and whether removing him would damage profitable relationships. This process made violence more bureaucratic. A man could be condemned through conversations he never heard during a meeting he did not know was taking place. The people making the decision might discuss his death alongside gambling territories, union elections, leadership changes, and financial disagreements. Once a decision was made, the order moved downward through the family hierarchy. The boss might speak to his underboss. The underboss could pass the instruction to a captain. The captain selected soldiers or associates to carry it out. Each layer separated senior leadership from the physical crime. The men who fired the weapons might not know every reason for the murder. They only needed to know that the order had been authorized. This separation was essential to the corporate character of the Mafia. A neighborhood gang often depended on the leader personally participating in violence. He demonstrated courage by confronting enemies and proved loyalty by taking the same risks as his followers. The 5 families developed a different model. The most powerful boss was often the man least likely to be seen committing a crime. His job was to manage. He allocated opportunities, recognized promotions, handled relationships with other families, and decided which disputes mattered enough to receive his attention. A boss who involved himself directly in every gambling collection or assault made himself easier to prosecute. Distance became evidence of status. The official structure beneath him helped maintain that distance. The underboss served as the second-ranking leader. Depending on the family and the personalities involved, he might supervise daily operations, settle disputes among captains, collect money, or act on the boss's behalf. If the boss went to prison or became ill, the underboss could assume greater authority. The consigliere held a different position. He was an advisor expected to offer judgment rather than simply command crews. He might mediate disagreements, carry messages to other families, or warn the boss that a decision was creating unnecessary enemies. Popular culture often presents the consigliere as a calm lawyer sitting beside the boss. Some consigliers were thoughtful and educated. Others were experienced criminals whose value came from age, reputation, and personal relationships. The position did not require a law degree or a quiet personality. It required trust. Below the administration were the captains. A captain controlled a crew of soldiers and associates. He was responsible for keeping them profitable and disciplined. The captain collected a share of their earnings and passed money upward. He also represented them when disputes reached senior leadership. This made the captain one of the most important figures in the organization. The boss could not know every bookmaker, truck hijacker, loan shark, or union representative working under the family. The captain translated the activity of the street into revenue for the administration. If his crew earned well and avoided unnecessary attention, the captain gained influence. If his men caused public violence, withheld money, or cooperated with investigators, he could be punished for failing to control them. Captains also created protection for the boss. A soldier might report that he had earned money from gambling. The captain passed an agreed amount upward without explaining every bet, customer, or collection. The administration could receive the profits while remaining removed from the details of the crime. This system encouraged a degree of independence. Soldiers were not salaried employees in the modern sense. They were expected to find ways to earn. A soldier might run a betting operation, collect illegal loans, arrange thefts, or control associates involved in legitimate companies. The family gave him a protected identity and access to opportunities. He gave the family money and obedience. Some soldiers became major earners. They developed crews of associates, political contacts, and interests in several businesses. Others made little money but were valued because they were willing to threaten or kill. The organization needed both types. A family consisting only of violent men would attract constant police attention and produce little stable income. A family consisting only of businessmen would struggle to enforce agreements. The Mafia's power came from combining administration with the credible threat of violence. Associates occupied the widest and least clearly defined level. An associate worked with the family, but had not been formally inducted. Some associates were young criminals hoping to become members. Others could never be inducted because they were not of the required Italian background. Some were legitimate businessmen, union officials, lawyers, politicians, police officers, or specialists who cooperated for money or protection. Associates allowed the family to reach far beyond its official membership. A trucking executive might provide vehicles and employment. A union delegate could influence hiring. A bookmaker might operate under family protection. A thief could supply stolen goods. A lawyer could carry messages while claiming professional confidentiality. Most people connected to a family were associates rather than made members. Formal membership was deliberately limited because it carried significance only if it remained exclusive. A made man was not simply an employee, he had been accepted into the organisation through a ceremony and placed under the protection of the family. The induction ritual varied over time and between organisations, but several elements became widely associated with it. The candidate was brought into a private room with members of the family. His finger might be pricked so that blood could fall onto a religious image. The image was burned in his hands while he swore loyalty and accepted death as the punishment for betrayal. The ceremony combined Catholic imagery with criminal obligation. It gave the organisation a sense of permanence and tradition that ordinary street gangs lacked. The oath promised loyalty to the family above almost everything else. A member was expected to follow orders, keep criminal matters secret, and place the organisation's interests ahead of personal disputes. He could not cooperate with law enforcement. He could not strike another made member without authorisation. He was expected to respect the wives and close relatives of other members. Rules concerning adultery, drug dealing, public behaviour, and contact with police varied and were often violated. Mafia codes were not moral principles consistently followed by honourable men. They were tools used to manage risk and discipline. A boss might condemn drug trafficking because long prison sentences encouraged informants. The same boss could accept money from drug dealers when the profits became too large to ignore. A rule against unnecessary violence could be enforced strictly against an unpopular soldier and ignored when a powerful captain committed the same offence. The Mafia's rules worked like the rules of many corrupt institutions. Their meaning depended heavily on who had the power to interpret them. Membership still provided real advantages. A made man had access to the family's dispute system. If someone owed him money, senior members could apply pressure. If an associate cheated him, that person could face punishment. If another family wanted to harm him, it was expected to seek approval. His name carried the reputation of the entire organisation. This protection could make ordinary business negotiations unequal. A restaurant owner considering a partnership with a made man understood that a later disagreement would not be settled between two individuals. The family stood behind one side. The Commission extended that principle from individuals to organisations. It provided a system for recognising bosses. A family could not always replace its leader without considering the reactions of other families. A disputed succession created opportunities for intervention, alliances, and violence. When a boss died or was removed, captains within the family might support different candidates. The Commission could recognise the leader most likely to maintain stability. That recognition gave the new boss legitimacy in dealings with other organisations. It did not guarantee obedience inside his own family, but it made opposition more dangerous. The Commission also helped divide criminal markets. Gambling territories, labour unions, docks and business sectors could not always be separated neatly. Two families might claim influence over the same union local. A bookmaker could accept bets in one family's neighbourhood while reporting to a captain from another. Instead of immediately using violence, bosses could negotiate. One family might keep the operation while paying a percentage to another. Territory could be exchanged. A neutral leader could mediate. The compromise might satisfy no one completely, but it preserved revenue. This ability to divide profits was one of the Mafia's greatest strengths. Street criminals often fought because each side wanted everything. Commission leaders understood that sharing a profitable business could be better than destroying it. The arrangement also allowed the Mafia to establish national partnerships. A gambling operation might need information from racetracks in several states. Stolen goods could be sold far from the city where they were taken. A fugitive might require protection from another family. National labour unions connected local branches across the country. Bosses who knew one another through commission meetings could cooperate without negotiating every relationship from the beginning. Communication usually passed through trusted representatives. Direct meetings between major leaders were risky. If police observed several bosses entering the same building, they could begin mapping relationships. The more powerful the men became, the more carefully they had to manage contact. Messages moved through underbosses, conciliars, captains, lawyers, and associates. A boss might meet one leader privately and ask him to carry information to another. Important conversations took place in restaurants, hotels, private homes, social clubs, and cars. Telephones were used cautiously. Criminals understood that calls could be monitored, especially as law enforcement techniques improved. They developed indirect language intended to conceal meaning. Names were avoided. Murders became pieces of work. Illegal businesses were described as interests or things. A troublesome person might be referred to only by a nickname. This language did not make conversations impossible to understand. It created uncertainty. A prosecutor might believe that a boss had ordered a murder, but belief was not enough. The government needed evidence that could survive in court. Vague statements gave defense lawyers room to argue that investigators had misunderstood ordinary conversation. The families also avoided written records whenever possible. An ordinary company needs contracts, payrolls, invoices, and minutes from meetings. The Mafia benefited from operating through memory and personal obligation. Money could be passed in envelopes. Loans could be recorded in private coded notebooks kept by lower-level participants. Senior leaders rarely signed documents connecting themselves to crimes. This made the organisation less efficient in some ways, but secrecy mattered more than perfect accounting. Trust served as paperwork. A man's reputation told others whether he paid his debts. A family's willingness to use violence enforced agreements that no court would recognise. Personal relationships replaced legal contracts. The Commission stood above this world as the final negotiating forum. Its members did not meet on a predictable schedule like corporate directors. Meetings occurred when necessary, and many decisions were made through smaller conversations rather than full gatherings. The famous image of every major boss sitting around one table was dangerous, precisely because it could reveal the structure investigators were trying to prove. Even so, large meetings sometimes occurred. One of the best known took place in Havana in December 1946. important American mobsters gathered in Cuba, officially for reasons that remained deliberately unclear. Lucky Luciano was present despite having been deported from the United States earlier that year. Luciano had spent years in prison after being convicted in New York on charges connected to compulsory prostitution. During the Second World War, American naval intelligence sought assistance in protecting the New York waterfront from sabotage and obtaining information related to the Allied invasion of Sicily. Luciano's exact contribution has been debated, but his sentence was later commuted on the condition that he be deported to Italy. His appearance in Havana demonstrated that deportation had not ended his influence. The meeting brought together leaders and representatives from several organizations. They discussed business, leadership, and the future of the National Syndicate. The gathering became surrounded by stories involving entertainment, money, and the return of a powerful exiled boss. Luciano hoped to remain close enough to the United States to exercise influence. American authorities pressured Cuba to expel him, and he was forced to return to Italy. The episode revealed both the reach and the limitations of Mafia power. Luciano could summon important men and maintain relationships across national borders. He could not openly defy the combined pressure of governments forever. Another large gathering would prove even more damaging. In November 1957, dozens of Mafia figures travelled to the rural community of Appalachian in upstate New York. The meeting took place at the home of Joseph Barbara, a businessman with organised crime connections. Local police became suspicious when they noticed expensive cars and unusual activity around the property. Officers established roadblocks and approached the house. Men fled through fields and wooded areas. Others were stopped in vehicles carrying large amounts of cash. The raid exposed the presence of major organised crime leaders from across the country. For years, senior law enforcement officials had minimised or denied the existence of a coordinated national mafia. Appalachian made that position difficult to maintain. The men caught or identified at the gathering represented families from multiple cities. The Commission's greatest strength had been its ability to coordinate while remaining difficult to prove. The meeting provided investigators with a visible map of relationships. It also demonstrated the danger of centralised leadership. The more organised the Mafia became, the more evidence it created that an organisation existed. A collection of unrelated gamblers could be prosecuted only for individual crimes. A national council raised the possibility of broader conspiracy cases. For decades, however, American law made it difficult to convict bosses for crimes carried out by subordinates. Prosecutors could arrest a soldier for extortion or murder. They could charge a bookmaker with illegal gambling. Connecting those crimes to a boss who had never touched the money, met the victim, or spoken directly to the offender was much harder. The corporate structure protected senior leadership. In a legal company, the chief executive can be held responsible for certain actions performed under company policy. In the criminal world of the mid-20th century, prosecutors often had to prove direct participation in each specific offence. The commission and family hierarchy were designed to prevent that proof. A boss received money because he was the boss, not because he appeared in the records of every gambling operation. He gave an order through several people and avoided saying exactly what he wanted. If the soldier carrying out the crime remained silent, the chain ended with him. Silence was therefore more valuable than almost any weapon. A member facing prison was expected to accept the sentence without identifying superiors. His family might receive financial help while he was away. His position could be restored after release. Cooperation, by contrast, meant betrayal and possible death. For many years, this system worked. Jurors were frightened. Witnesses changed their stories. Victims refused to testify. Police investigations stopped at the crew level. Bosses continued receiving income while younger men absorbed the arrests. The commission provided stability because the cost of disobedience remained high, and the chance of reaching the leadership remained low. That stability should not be confused with peace. Families continued plotting against one another. Bosses formed private alliances. Captains resented the amount of money they were required to pass upward. Ambitious underbosses waited for leaders to become vulnerable. Commission decisions could restrain these rivalries, but they could not remove them. A leader agreed to collective rule only while collective rule served him. If he believed he could eliminate a rival without suffering consequences, rules became less important. The corporate comparison also had limits. A legal corporation can appeal to courts, publish policies, and replace executives through formal procedures. The Mafia's final authority remained violence. Meetings and negotiation worked because every participant knew what would happen if agreement failed. The Commission did not replace the gun. It decided when the gun could be used. By the 1940s and 1950s, this system allowed the five families to expand without repeating the open warfare that had created them. They could cooperate in gambling, labour racketeering, construction, and political corruption while preserving their own identities. Each family developed a reputation based on its leadership and principal interests. Some bosses preferred public influence and relationships with politicians. Others avoided attention and governed through trusted intermediaries. Certain families became especially powerful on the waterfront. Others built influence in construction, trucking, garment businesses, airports, or specific unions. The Commission allowed these differences to exist inside one criminal order. It also created a new kind of mafia leader. The successful boss no longer needed to be the most feared gunman in his neighborhood. He needed patience, alliances, and the ability to manage competing interests. Frank Costello became one of the clearest examples. Costello rose within the organisation associated with Luciano and developed deep political connections. He was known less for personal violence than for access. His relationships with officials, judges, businessmen, and political operators gave him influence that a street killer could not match. He understood that one friendly decision inside government could be worth more than a dozen threats. Vito Genovese represented another style. He was ambitious, forceful, and determined to control the organisation that would later carry his name. His rivalry with Costello showed how different leadership methods could exist within the same family. Costello relied on political reach and careful relationships. Genovese relied more heavily on traditional criminal authority and the willingness to use force. Their struggle did not immediately produce a full-scale war because the commission system created restraints. Allies had to be considered. Other bosses had interests in the outcome. A reckless move could unite families against the person who made it. The system encouraged conspiracies to develop slowly. A leader isolated his target before attacking. He weakened relationships, influenced captains, and tested whether other bosses would object. The shooting itself, when it came, could be the final step in a process that had lasted years. This was crime operating through administration. By the middle of the century, the Commission had transformed the five families from unstable gangs into durable institutions. They possessed chains of command, defined membership, procedures for succession, territorial understandings, and methods for settling disputes. They were still criminal organizations built on theft, coercion, corruption, and murder. Their corporate structure did not make them respectable. It made them more effective. The result was a system capable of surviving the loss of individual leaders. Lucky Luciano could be imprisoned and deported. His family continued. A boss could be murdered, and captains kept collecting money. A gambling room could be closed, and another open nearby. A corrupt official could lose office, and the family searched for a replacement. The organisation mattered more than the man. That principle would carry the five families into the period of their greatest power. They had learned how to limit internal war, distance bosses from crimes, and coordinate across industries. Their leaders were becoming figures of national importance inside the underworld, even when most Americans had never heard their names. New York was entering an age in which the five families would influence the docks, unions, construction projects, political clubs, nightclubs, airports, and wholesale markets at the same time. Their power would produce enormous wealth. But it would also create rivalries within every family. The system that protected the bosses gave ambitious men a structure they could capture, and the commission that prevented wars could become another prize worth fighting to control. By the 1950s, the five families had become part of the operating structure of New York. They did not govern the city, and they never controlled every neighborhood, business, union, or public official. Their power was less complete and more practical than that. They had influence in enough places to affect how entire industries worked. They could arrange employment, delay construction, protect gambling operations, move stolen goods, settle disputes, and make legitimate businessmen consider criminal interests before making ordinary decisions. The families had survived the end of Prohibition, the imprisonment of important leaders, leadership changes, internal rivalries, and repeated police investigations. Their structure allowed them to continue when individual members disappeared. Crews remained active, money still moved upward. New bosses replaced old ones. This durability carried the Mafia into the period commonly remembered as its golden age. The phrase can be misleading. It sounds glamorous, as though these decades were defined mainly by nightclubs, expensive suits, celebrity friendships, and men eating long dinners in private restaurant rooms. Those images were real, but they represented only the visible edge of a much larger system. For the families, the period was golden because their earnings were broad, their labour influence was strong, and the government still struggled to prove how the organisations operated. The public knew gangsters existed, yet many Americans did not fully understand that local crimes were connected through permanent families with recognised bosses, rules, and national relationships. For ordinary people caught inside their rackets, there was nothing golden about it. A business owner paying for protection did not experience the Mafia as entertainment. A dock worker denied employment because he opposed a corrupt union officer did not see romance in the system. A contractor forced to use an overpriced supplier was not participating in a colourful neighbourhood tradition. The power of the five families came from transferring money away from those people and toward men who controlled access. By the middle of the 20th century, each family had developed its own leadership, alliances, strengths, and internal problems. The names now associated with them came from bosses who became prominent during later stages of their history. The organisation that developed from Lucky Luciano's family eventually became known as the Genovese family. The group once led by Vincent Mangano became the Gambino family. Gaetano Galliano's organisation became the Lucchese family. Joseph Profaci's family eventually took the Colombo name. The organisation founded under Salvatore Maranzano later became the Bonanno family. These labels make the five families appear fixed and easily separated. In practice, boundaries shifted. Crews worked in overlapping territories. Members formed partnerships across family lines. A gambling operation might involve men from more than one organisation, and a labour racket could depend on cooperation among several families. The Commission helped regulate these relationships, but personal alliances often mattered as much as formal rules. A boss who had the support of several other leaders was difficult to challenge. A boss who lost that support could become vulnerable even if his own title remained unchanged. Power depended on the loyalty of captains, the cooperation of other families, access to profitable rackets, and the ability to prevent law enforcement from reaching the administration. The Genovese family was often regarded within the underworld as one of the most sophisticated and powerful of the five. Its earlier leadership included Luciano and Frank Costello. Luciano had helped create the Commission, but his conviction and deportation removed him from direct control in New York. Costello then became the leading figure in the organisation. Costello was known for political influence. Newspapers called him the Prime Minister of the Underworld, a title that reflected his reputation for negotiation and access rather than formal authority over every Mafia family. He cultivated relationships with politicians, judges, businessmen, and figures connected to New York's democratic political machine. He understood that public power could be used quietly. A favourable appointment, A warning about an investigation or a sympathetic decision from an official might protect criminal income more effectively than intimidation. Costello also had important interests in gambling. Slot machines were especially profitable because they could produce steady cash with little daily supervision. Machines placed in bars, restaurants, stores or private clubs collected small amounts from many customers. Operators divided the revenue with property owners and paid protection to the organisation controlling the territory. The machines were illegal in many jurisdictions, but enforcement could be reduced through bribery and political influence. Costello's power did not go unchallenged. Vito Genovese had long wanted control of the organisation. He had worked with Luciano and other major figures during the rise of the modern Mafia, but he was ambitious enough to see former allies as obstacles. Genovese left the United States in the late 1930s while facing a murder charge and spent time in fascist Italy. He returned during the Second World War and eventually escaped conviction after witnesses disappeared or died under suspicious circumstances. Once back in New York, he began rebuilding his position. The conflict between Genovese and Costello developed carefully. Genovese could not simply announce that he wanted the family. Costello had powerful allies, including Albert Anastasia, who led the organisation that would become the Gambino family. Removing Costello required weakening the people around him. In May 1957, Costello was shot in the lobby of his Manhattan apartment building. The gunman was Vincent Gigante, a Genovese loyalist who would later become one of the most important bosses in Mafia history. The bullet struck Costello in the head but did not kill him. According to later accounts, the shooter called out before firing, causing Costello to turn. That movement may have saved his life. The wound was relatively minor, but the message was not. Costello understood that the struggle had reached its final stage. Rather than begin a war, he stepped away from active leadership. He retained some influence and lived for many more years, but Genovese took control of the family. Later in 1957, Albert Anastasia was murdered while sitting in a barber chair at the Park Sheraton Hotel in Manhattan. Anastasia had one of the most violent reputations in the American Mafia. He had been associated with the Brooklyn waterfront and with the group popularly known as Murder Incorporated, a network of killers linked to organised crime during the 1930s and early 1940s. The popular image of Murder Incorporated as one formal national assassination company may simplify a more complicated reality. There were criminals who carried out murders for Mafia and Jewish underworld leaders, and several were connected through overlapping groups in Brooklyn. Anastasia's name became permanently associated with them, strengthening his reputation for brutality. By the 1950s, he controlled the former Mangano family. His leadership created enemies. He was accused of selling memberships, ordering unnecessary killings, and behaving unpredictably. Carlo Gambino, his underboss, was patient, quiet, and well-connected. Anastasia's murder removed another major obstacle to the changing balance of power. The killers were never conclusively identified in court, and theories about who planned the assassination have continued for decades. Gambino benefited most directly. He became boss, and the family eventually took his name. Carlo Gambino represented a style of leadership very different from Anastasia's. He avoided unnecessary publicity, spoke carefully, and built alliances through patience. He understood that a boss did not need to be the loudest man in a room. He needed other powerful men to believe that cooperation with him was safer and more profitable than opposition. Under Gambino, the family expanded its influence in construction, trucking, unions, the waterfront, gambling, and other businesses. It became one of the strongest organizations in New York. Gambino's authority also benefited from family relationships. His relatives and trusted associates occupied important positions. Marriage could connect criminal networks just as it connected legitimate business families. These ties were not enough by themselves to guarantee loyalty, but they created additional obligations in a world where trust was always limited. The Gambino family developed a reputation for size, money, and influence. Its crews operated throughout New York and beyond. Some members were involved in sophisticated business rackets. Others remained street criminals engaged in robbery, hijacking, loan sharking, and illegal gambling. This variety was common across all 5 families. The Lucchese family was often regarded as smaller than the Gambino or Genovese organisations, but it was highly effective. Tommy Lucchese had been involved in organised crime since the early decades of the 20th century. He understood both street-level operations and corporate infiltration. He cultivated relationships in the garment industry, trucking, construction and labour unions. Lucchese was known for political and business connections. Like Costello and Gambino, he understood that access could produce more money than public violence. The garment district provided the family with influence over manufacturers, trucking companies, contractors, and unions. Clothing production depended on strict schedules. A delayed shipment could miss a retail season and lose much of its value. Anyone able to control transportation or labour could demand payment from companies that could not afford delay. The Lucchese family also developed influence at airports, particularly as commercial air freight expanded after the Second World War. Airports contained high-value goods moving through large, complicated systems. Cargo handlers, drivers, security personnel, and warehouse workers all had access to shipments. Theft could be organised more efficiently when criminals had information from inside. A worker might identify which crate contained jewellery, electronics, cash, or luxury goods. A driver could remove it. A warehouse contact could alter paperwork. A fence could sell the merchandise through legitimate or underground markets. The family did not need to control the entire airport. A few strategically placed people could create a reliable theft network. The famous Lufthansa robbery at John F. Kennedy International Airport occurred much later, in 1978, but the criminal relationships that made such thefts possible developed during earlier decades. Airport rackets grew from the same principle the Mafia had used on the docks: control information, control workers, and place trusted people where valuable goods passed through narrow points. The Bonanno family followed a different path. Joseph Bonanno became boss while still relatively young, and remained in power for decades. He came from a Sicilian background and maintained strong connections to traditional Mafia culture, family relationships, and networks extending beyond New York. His organisation developed interest in gambling, loan sharking, garment businesses, trucking, and other rackets. Bonanno also established influence outside the city, including relationships in Arizona, Canada, and Sicily. For many years, he appeared secure. Bonanno presented himself as a man of tradition and respect. Later in life, he published an autobiography in which he described the Mafia through the language of honour, family, and an older social order. That presentation should be treated carefully. Mafia leaders often described their organisations as alternatives to a corrupt or unreliable government. They emphasised loyalty, mediation, and protection. This account ignored the coercion that supported their authority. A system cannot be considered honourable when disagreement may be answered with murder. Bonanno's long leadership eventually encouraged greater ambition. By the early 1960s, he reportedly became involved in a plan to remove several rival bosses, including Carlo Gambino and Tommy Lucchese. The alleged conspiracy was discovered before it succeeded. Its failure damaged Bonanno's standing and helped produce an internal conflict later called the Banana War, a name derived from the Bonanno surname rather than the nature of the dispute. The conflict divided the family between supporters of Bonanno and factions recognised by the Commission. Joseph Bonanno disappeared for a period, claiming later that he had been kidnapped. Other accounts suggested that he had gone into hiding. Whatever the exact circumstances, his absence created confusion over leadership. The Bonanno family's internal struggle demonstrated the limits of the Commission. It could recognise one faction and attempt to settle the dispute, but it could not prevent every member from following personal loyalties. The family survived, though its position within the national mafia was weakened. The organisation later known as the Colombo family experienced even greater instability. Joseph Profazzi had led it since the reorganisation of 1931. His family earned money through gambling, loan sharking, construction, labour racketeering and food businesses. Profazzi himself was involved in legitimate enterprises, including olive oil importation. He also demanded payments from members of his organisation. Soldiers were expected to provide regular tribute, and resentment grew among men who believed the administration was taking too much, while offering too little in return. The Gallo brothers, led by Joseph Crazy Joe Gallo, rebelled against Profazzi in the early 1960s. They kidnapped several senior family figures and attempted to force changes in leadership and financial arrangements. This became the first of several violent conflicts within the family. The rebellion was not a campaign against criminal exploitation. The Gallos wanted a larger share of power and income. Their challenge revealed the same tension present throughout the mafia structure. Soldiers and captains were expected to earn independently, but the boss demanded tribute. When men believed the division was unfair, organisational loyalty became fragile. Profazzi died in 1962 and was succeeded briefly by Joseph Magliocco. Magliocco became connected to Bonanno's alleged plot against rival bosses. After the plan was exposed, the commission forced him to step down. Joseph Colombo then became boss, and the family eventually took his name. Colombo gained public attention in a way most bosses tried to avoid. In 1970, he helped establish the Italian-American Civil Rights League. The organisation protested negative stereotypes and objected to the use of terms such as mafia in public discussion. It attracted many ordinary Italian-Americans who had legitimate reasons to oppose discrimination. Italian-Americans had long been unfairly associated with organised crime. Most had no connection to the mafia, yet criminality was frequently treated as an ethnic characteristic. The League addressed a real prejudice. Colombo's role complicated the campaign. A mafia boss was leading a public movement that denied or minimised the existence of the organisation he headed. Large rallies brought him press coverage, political contact, and a level of visibility that alarmed other mafia leaders. The League also pressured companies and officials to avoid particular language. Producers of the film, The Godfather, faced protests and negotiations before the movie was released. Some senior mobsters believed Colombo's public activity attracted too much attention. A boss was supposed to influence politics quietly, not become a public personality. In June 1971, Colombo was shot during a League rally at Columbus Circle. The gunman, Jerome Johnson, was immediately killed by one of Colombo's associates, making it difficult to determine with certainty who had ordered the attack. Colombo survived, but was left severely disabled until his death years later. The shooting produced another internal struggle within the family and continued the instability that had begun under Profazzi. Despite their differences, all five families benefited from similar conditions during the Golden Age. Illegal gambling remained one of their most dependable sources of cash. Bookmaking allowed customers to bet on horse racing, boxing, baseball, football, basketball, and other events. Bets were placed through local bookmakers connected to larger networks. The bookmaker needed access to odds, results, credit information, and protection. He also needed enough money to pay winners. Family backing provided financial support and reduced the risk of independent criminals robbing the operation. Customers often placed bets on credit. Losses were collected later, sometimes through violence or the threat of violence. A gambling debt could lead directly into loan sharking. A borrower might receive money at interest rates far above anything allowed by law. Payments were made weekly, and the borrower could pay interest for months without reducing the original amount. For example, a person borrowing $10,000 at 2 points per week owed $200 every week in interest. Paying the $200 did not necessarily reduce the $10,000 principal. Missing a payment caused the unpaid interest to be added to the debt, or produced immediate pressure. The lender did not rely on a court to enforce the agreement. The threat behind the loan also gave the family access to businesses. An owner who could not repay might surrender part of his company, provide fake invoices, store stolen goods, or cooperate in fraud. The Mafia converted debt into control. Numbers games remained popular in working-class neighbourhoods. Customers placed small bets on number combinations, hoping for a large payoff. The business required collectors, record keepers, and central offices where bets could be calculated. Each individual wager might be worth only a few dollars. Thousands of wagers produced substantial daily revenue. Narcotics became a more controversial source of income. Mafia rules were often said to prohibit drug dealing. Some bosses publicly discouraged it, because narcotics convictions carried long sentences and created pressure for defendants to cooperate with the government. In reality, members and associates of several families participated heavily in the drug trade. The profits were too large to ignore. Heroin moved from production areas through international networks into American cities. Sicilian and American organised crime figures developed relationships that would later become associated with the French Connection and other trafficking systems. Some bosses kept a formal distance while accepting money from captains involved in narcotics. Others punished dealers only when the activity created publicity or threatened leadership. The contradiction was typical. The stated rule protected the organisation's reputation. The violation produced revenue. Hijacking and theft were also major businesses. Trucks carried clothing, food, cigarettes, appliances, alcohol and electronics through the city. A driver could be bribed, threatened or forced to cooperate. Cargo information could be obtained from warehouse employees or shipping records. A hijacked truck produced goods that had to be stored and sold. This required a network of garages, warehouses, wholesalers, retailers and fences. Legitimate businesses sometimes purchased stolen merchandise because it was cheaper. A store owner might know exactly where the goods came from and still accept them. Others avoided asking questions. The criminal economy depended on this willingness to convert illegal goods into ordinary sales. Labour racketeering remained one of the clearest signs of mafia power. Families influenced locals connected to construction, trucking, the waterfront, hotels, restaurants, sanitation, and manufacturing. Corrupt union officials could demand payments from employers in exchange for labour peace. They could also steal from members. Union dues, pension contributions, and welfare funds created large pools of money. These funds could be invested in projects connected to organised crime or used to reward favoured businesses. The Teamsters Central States Pension Fund became especially important to organised crime interests outside New York. It financed casinos and other projects in Las Vegas, giving mafia groups access to capital that legitimate banks might not provide. New York families benefited from the broader national relationships created through labour and gambling. Their influence was local, but their partnerships extended far beyond the city. Las Vegas became one of the most visible symbols of mafia wealth. Casinos generated enormous cash flow. Criminal investors could take money directly from casino earnings before it appeared in official accounting records, a practice known as skimming. The profits were shared among organisations that had financed or protected the operations. New York families participated alongside Midwestern and other mafia groups. The system required cooperation. No single family could dominate every casino, union, transportation company, and political relationship involved. This was the commission model working on a national scale. Back in New York, social clubs served as local centres of family activity. A club might appear to be a simple neighbourhood room where men played cards, drank coffee, watched television, and talked. Some had formal names. Others were known only by the street or the person who used them. The club gave a captain or boss a place to receive visitors without inviting everyone into his home. Soldiers could report earnings. Associates could request help. Disputes could be discussed. They also created a surveillance problem. Law enforcement officers could watch who entered and left. Photographs of known criminals meeting one another helped investigators establish relationships. Mobsters responded by walking during conversations, meeting in cars, or using intermediaries. Some held discussions in noisy public places where recording equipment was less effective. They understood that the government was becoming more interested. The televised hearings of the United States Senate Special Committee to Investigate Organized Crime, commonly called the Kefauver Committee, brought organized crime into American living rooms in 1950 and 1951. Senator Estes Kefauver and other members questioned gamblers, politicians, law enforcement officials, and suspected mobsters. Millions watched the proceedings on television. Frank Costello's appearance became especially memorable. Costello refused to allow television cameras to show his face, so viewers saw only his hands. The image created a strange form of publicity. The hidden face made him appear more powerful and mysterious than a full portrait might have done. The hearings educated the public about connections among gambling, politics, and organised crime. They did not destroy the families, but they weakened the belief that crime was only a local problem. The Appalachian meeting in 1957 caused even greater damage to that belief. When police interrupted the gathering in upstate New York, dozens of important Mafia figures attempted to escape. Some ran through fields, others were stopped at roadblocks. The meeting proved that powerful criminals from different cities maintained direct relationships. J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, had long focused the Bureau heavily on communism, espionage, bank robbery, and other federal priorities. The FBI had been slow to treat the Mafia as a coordinated national organization. After Appalachian, that position became difficult to maintain. The Bureau began devoting more resources to organized crime. Agents developed informants, conducted surveillance, and installed listening devices. They created charts showing family structures and relationships. Even then, prosecution remained difficult. Knowing that a boss led a family was not the same as proving that he had ordered a particular crime. The code of silence protected the hierarchy. Members generally refused to explain internal structure. That barrier began to weaken in 1963. Joseph Valachi, a soldier in the Genovese family, testified before a United States Senate subcommittee. He described the organization he called Cosa Nostra, explained its hierarchy, and identified members and leaders. Valachi was not the first criminal to cooperate with authorities, but his public testimony had enormous impact. Americans heard an insider confirm that formal Mafia families existed. He described induction ceremonies, ranks, rules, and the commission. His testimony gave the public language for a structure investigators had struggled to demonstrate. The phrase La Cosa Nostra became widely used by law enforcement, though Mafia members themselves did not always use it consistently. The five families were increasingly visible as organizations rather than collections of individual criminals. Visibility did not immediately end their power. During the 1960s and 1970s, the families remained deeply involved in profitable rackets. Their leaders adapted to investigations. They used acting bosses, intermediaries, and careful communication. Some bosses avoided public meetings and rarely spoke directly about crimes. The Golden Age continued because the government had not yet developed its most effective legal weapon against the structure itself. Investigators could prosecute individuals, but the families replaced them. A soldier went to prison, and another collected his accounts. A captain died, and his crew was divided. A boss stepped down, and a successor continued the same relationships. The system absorbed losses. Its greatest strength was also creating a growing weakness. The five families had become large, permanent, and clearly organized. Their hierarchy protected leaders from traditional prosecutions, but it also meant that the families could potentially be treated as continuing criminal enterprises. The government needed laws and investigative methods capable of connecting individual acts to the organization that benefited from them. Until that happened, the bosses remained confident. Carlo Gambino died of natural causes in 1976 after decades of criminal activity and only limited imprisonment. He had avoided the public destruction that overtook many other leaders. Before his death, he supported his brother-in-law Paul Castellano as successor. the decision angered Agnello della Croce, a powerful underboss with strong support among the family's street crews. Della Croce accepted the arrangement, partly out of loyalty to Gambino, but the division between Castigliano's business-oriented faction and Della Croce's more traditional street faction remained. This tension would later help produce one of the most famous mafia assassinations in New York history. The Genovese family also developed methods of hiding leadership. After Vito Genovese was convicted on narcotics charges in 1959, he continued to exert influence from prison until his death. Later, bosses became increasingly secretive. Vincent Gigante, the man who had shot Frank Costello, eventually rose to lead the family. He became famous for pretending to suffer from severe mental illness. He wandered Greenwich Village in a bathrobe, spoke to parking meters, and behaved unpredictably in public. The performance earned him the nickname the Oddfather. For years, lawyers argued that Gigante was mentally incompetent. At the same time, he quietly directed one of the most powerful mafia families in the country. His deception reflected the changing environment. The loud public boss was becoming a liability. Survival required appearing harmless, distant, or absent. The five families had reached the height of their influence, but the conditions that supported that influence were beginning to change. Public denial had weakened after Apalachin and Valachi. Federal agents were mapping family structures. Electronic surveillance was improving. Prosecutors were studying how money moved through unions and legitimate businesses. The families still controlled profitable operations, and many leaders believed the old system would continue indefinitely. They had survived hearings, raids, informants, and prison sentences before. What they did not yet fully understand was that the government was changing its approach. Instead of prosecuting only the bookmaker, the thief, or the killer, federal authorities were preparing to prosecute the organization. A law passed in 1970 would eventually allow prosecutors to place the structure of a mafia family before a jury and argue that apparently separate crimes were parts of one continuing enterprise. It would take years for investigators to learn how to use that law effectively. During those years, ambitious men inside the families would create additional evidence through violence, greed, and public behavior. The empire had not begun to collapse, but the protection that had allowed it to expand was becoming less reliable. The bosses were still collecting money, settling disputes, and appointing successors, while investigators were learning how to turn the mafia's own hierarchy against it. The law that would change the government's fight against the mafia did not appear to be revolutionary when it was passed. In 1970, Congress approved the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, usually known as RICO. It was part of a broader federal effort to combat organized crime. The law gave prosecutors a way to treat repeated criminal acts as part of one continuing enterprise, rather than as a collection of unrelated offences. That distinction mattered, because the five families had been designed to separate leaders from individual crimes. A boss did not need to take bets, collect a loan, hijack a truck, or threaten a contractor personally. He supervised captains who supervised soldiers who worked through associates. Traditional prosecutions often stopped with the person closest to the crime. RICO allowed prosecutors to move in the opposite direction. They could begin with individual acts such as extortion, bribery, illegal gambling, fraud, arson, narcotics trafficking, or murder, and demonstrate that those acts formed a pattern conducted through an organization. The enterprise itself could be placed at the center of the case. A boss who had insulated himself from one specific crime could still be held responsible for directing or participating in the affairs of a criminal organization. The law did not immediately destroy the mafia. For several years, many prosecutors were uncertain how to use it. RICO cases were complicated. They required evidence of structure, continuity, relationships, and repeated criminal conduct. The government needed more than a witness who had seen one crime. It needed to show how the family operated. That meant mapping the hierarchy. Investigators had to identify the boss, underboss, consigliere, captains, soldiers, and associates. They needed to establish how orders moved downward and how money moved upward. They had to prove that apparently separate crimes benefited the same enterprise. This was difficult, but the families were giving the government more information than they realised. Every social club created patterns. Every meeting connected known figures. Every telephone call, restaurant conversation, wedding, funeral and private visit helped investigators understand who reported to whom. The Mafia had survived for decades through secrecy, but it was also a social organisation. Its members needed to communicate. They needed to collect money, settle disputes, approve promotions and coordinate partnerships. An empire cannot operate without contact. Federal agents began using surveillance more aggressively. They followed cars, photographed meetings, recorded license plates, watched social clubs, and developed informants. Listening devices were installed in cars, homes, offices, and gathering places after legal approval or in earlier periods through methods that later became controversial. The recordings revealed a criminal world that sounded less glamorous than many outsiders expected. Men argued over percentages. They complained about unpaid debts. They discussed who had failed to show respect, who was making money, and who was attracting too much attention. They spoke about murders indirectly, using phrases intended to conceal meaning. The conversations often resembled business meetings conducted by people who knew that an act of violence remained available if negotiation failed. Investigators also learned to use the family hierarchy as an organisational chart. A soldier's conversation might identify his captain. A captain's meetings could lead to the administration. If several crimes could be connected to the same chain of command, prosecutors could begin building a RICO case. The process required patience. An investigation might continue for years before arrests were made. Agents sometimes watched crimes occur without intervening immediately, because arresting one participant could destroy the opportunity to reach the leadership. This created difficult decisions. Allowing an operation to continue could produce stronger evidence, but delay could also expose more victims to theft, intimidation, or violence. The families faced a different problem. They were accustomed to investigations that targeted individuals. A soldier went to prison and remained silent. A replacement assumed his responsibilities. The organisation continued. RICO threatened continuity itself. The law also allowed the government to seize property connected to racketeering. A conviction could cost criminals not only their freedom, but also their businesses, assets, and influence. Money that had taken decades to accumulate could be removed through one successful case. The change in law enforcement coincided with a change inside the Mafia. The old code of silence was weakening. Members had always cooperated occasionally, despite the organisation's insistence that betrayal was unthinkable. Criminals became informants to avoid prison, defeat rivals, or protect themselves. What changed was the scale of the pressure. Federal sentences were becoming longer. Prosecutors could charge several defendants together and threaten them with decades in prison. A soldier could no longer assume that accepting a sentence would mean serving a few years before returning to his crew. He might die in prison. The government also developed stronger witness protection programs. An informant and his family could be relocated, given new identities, and supported while beginning another life. The protection was imperfect, and cooperation remained dangerous, but it became possible for a witness to imagine surviving outside the Mafia. That possibility changed the calculation. A member who had spent his adult life believing the family would protect him could discover that the family expected silence, but offered little help when he was arrested. Legal fees accumulated. Money promised to his wife or children failed to arrive. A captain he had trusted denied responsibility. The organisation demanded loyalty most strongly when it had the least incentive to return it. The first major public crack in the code had come through Joseph Valachi's testimony in the 1960s. Later informants would provide more detailed and damaging evidence. Some cooperators understood only one crew. Others had access to senior leadership. The most valuable witnesses could explain the meaning behind recorded conversations, identify voices, and describe how orders were intentionally phrased. Without an insider, a boss's statement that a problem should be handled might appear vague. A cooperating member could tell a jury that everyone in the room understood it as an instruction to commit murder. The family's indirect language could then be translated into evidence. During the 1970s and early 1980s, federal prosecutors gradually became more effective at using RICO. Organised crime strike forces brought together investigators and lawyers with specialised knowledge. They did not treat each gambling arrest or union bribe as an isolated event. They looked for the organisation behind it. One of the central figures in this changing approach was Rudolph Giuliani, who became the United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York in 1983. Giuliani and his prosecutors pursued the leadership of the five families through a case that became known as the Mafia Commission trial. The government's theory was direct. The commission was not simply a gathering of acquaintances. It was a governing body through which the leaders of the five families coordinated criminal activity, settled disputes, and controlled major rackets. If prosecutors could prove that structure, they could charge the bosses together. The investigation relied heavily on electronic surveillance and evidence gathered by the FBI and other agencies. One particularly important source came from the home of Salvatore Avellino, a Lucchese associate involved in the private sanitation industry, and from surveillance connected to other organised crime figures. Investigators also obtained recordings from locations where senior leaders believed they could speak safely. The bosses had spent their careers using layers of insulation. Now their own discussions were being used to show that those layers formed one enterprise. The commission case focused partly on the Mafia's control of major concrete contracts in New York. Construction companies bidding on jobs above a certain value were allegedly required to participate in a system controlled by organised crime. The arrangement allowed selected companies to win contracts, while others submitted deliberately higher bids. Mafia leaders received payments and ensured cooperation through union influence and the threat of disruption. To the public, the projects appeared legitimate. Buildings were constructed, workers were paid, contracts were signed. The hidden cost was built into the price. Taxpayers, developers, and honest competitors paid for an arrangement designed to protect criminal profits. The Mafia Commission trial began in 1985. Defendants included senior figures from several families. Anthony Salerno, widely known as Fat Tony, was presented as the boss of the Genovese family, although later evidence indicated that Vincent Gigante held greater authority behind the scenes. The use of Salerno as a visible front illustrated how deeply deception had entered Mafia leadership. Gigante had spent years pretending to be mentally ill. He wandered through Greenwich Village in a bathrobe and slippers, appeared confused in public, and entered psychiatric facilities. The performance was intended to discourage prosecution and conceal his control of the family. Even inside the Mafia, appearances could be arranged. Other defendants in the commission case included Anthony Corallo of the Lucchese family and Carmine Persico of the Colombo family. Paul Castellano of the Gambino family had also been charged, but he would not live to stand trial. The commission case was historic because it attacked the ruling level of the Mafia at once. Earlier prosecutions had removed individual bosses. This case treated their cooperation as evidence of a shared criminal enterprise. In November 1986, the principal defendants were convicted. Several received sentences of 100 years in prison. The message was unmistakable. The government no longer needed to catch a boss holding a gun or collecting a gambling debt. It could prove that he directed an organisation whose members repeatedly committed crimes. The hierarchy that had protected the bosses could now be used to convict them. At nearly the same time, another prosecution struck the Gambino family. Paul Castellano had inherited leadership after Carlo Gambino's death in 1976. Castellano lived in a large home on Staten Island and preferred white-collar rackets, construction interests and business schemes. He distanced himself from some of the family's street-level members. That distance created resentment. Many soldiers identified more strongly with Agnello Della Croce, the underboss who supervised important Manhattan crews. Della Croce had the reputation of a traditional street leader. He was respected by men involved in gambling, hijacking, loan sharking, and violence. Among those men was John Gotti. Gotti grew up in a working-class family and became involved in street crime at a young age. He joined a Gambino crew based in Queens and developed a reputation for aggression, confidence, and personal loyalty to Della Croce. He also wanted power. Gotti's crew became involved in narcotics trafficking, an activity Castellano claimed to prohibit. Federal investigators recorded conversations connected to the drug operation. If Castellano heard the tapes, Gotti and his allies feared that they would be killed for violating family rules and exposing the organization to legal danger. Della Croce's presence had provided some protection. As underboss, he could mediate between Castellano and the street faction. Della Croce died of cancer in December 1985. Castellano did not attend the funeral, a decision that Gotti and others interpreted as disrespectful. More importantly, the man who might have prevented an open challenge was gone. Gotti began organising the assassination of his boss. Under Mafia rules, killing a family boss without commission approval was one of the most serious possible violations. Gotti did not seek formal permission because the other bosses were unlikely to approve. Instead, he quietly contacted influential figures and attempted to determine whether they would oppose the change. On December 16, 1985, Paul Castellano and his underboss Thomas Bellotti arrived outside Sparks Steakhouse in Midtown Manhattan. Gunmen approached and opened fire. Castellano and Bellotti were killed on the street as evening traffic moved through the neighborhood. Gotti and an associate reportedly watched from a nearby car to confirm that the murders had been completed. The assassination was public, dramatic, and impossible to ignore. It resembled the older gangland killings that the Commission had been created to prevent. A boss had been murdered without approval outside a busy restaurant in the centre of New York. Gotti took control of the Gambino family. He also became a celebrity. The press called him the Dapper Don because of his expensive suits and carefully groomed appearance. After he defeated several criminal cases, another nickname appeared, the Teflon Don. Charges seemed unable to stick to him. Gotti smiled outside courthouses, spoke to reporters, and appeared comfortable with attention. Crowds gathered. Some people treated him as a neighborhood hero or symbol of resistance to authority. The publicity made him one of the most recognizable mafia bosses in American history. It also made him dangerous to the larger organization. Traditional bosses preferred obscurity. Gotti's public behavior encouraged reporters and investigators to focus on him. His meetings attracted surveillance. His conversations became valuable targets for recording devices. A criminal leader could not be both famous and hidden. Gotti held meetings at the Ravenite Social Club in Manhattan. FBI agents monitored the location and photographed the mobsters who visited. The club became an unintentional display of the family's structure. Gotti attempted to avoid surveillance by holding sensitive conversations in an apartment above the club and during walks outside. Investigators eventually succeeded in installing listening devices where he believed he could speak privately. The recordings captured Gotti discussing family affairs and murders. They also revealed his opinion of his underboss, Salvatore Gravano, known as Sammy the Bull. Gravano had helped Gotti take control of the family and participated in numerous killings. He was a powerful figure with interest in construction and other rackets. When the two men were arrested and faced trial, prosecutors played recordings suggesting that Gotti intended to blame Gravano for crimes committed under the boss's authority. Gravano understood what that meant. The code of silence demanded that he accept life imprisonment to protect a boss who was preparing to sacrifice him. He chose to cooperate. In 1991, Gravano became one of the highest-ranking Mafia members to testify for the federal government. He had admitted involvement in 19 murders and described the internal operations of the Gambino family. His testimony was devastating because he had been inside the administration. He could explain Gotti's orders, identify participants, and interpret recorded conversations. At trial, jurors heard the boss's own voice and the underboss's explanation of what his words meant. In April 1992, Gotti was convicted of murder, racketeering, obstruction of justice, and other crimes. He received a sentence of life imprisonment without parole. The Teflon no longer held. Gotti's conviction became a public symbol of Mafia decline, but the deeper damage came from the method used against him. Electronic surveillance, RICO, and an insider witness had worked together. The government could record the boss, charge the enterprise, and persuade a senior member to explain the evidence. This combination would be used repeatedly. The Lucchese family suffered its own destructive conflict under Vittorio Amuso and Anthony Casso. Amuso became boss during the late 1980s, while Casso served as underboss and became one of the most feared men in New York organized crime. Their leadership was marked by suspicion and extreme violence. They ordered murders against members believed to be disloyal, careless, or likely to cooperate. Entire crews came under suspicion. Some men were killed for failing to carry out other killings. The effort to preserve control weakened the family. Members fled, cooperated with authorities, or lost confidence in leadership. A criminal organization depends on fear, but fear becomes destructive when no one believes loyalty will protect him. Casso also benefited from corrupt contacts inside law enforcement. Two New York police detectives, Luis Ippolito and Stephen Caracappa, provided information to organized crime and participated in murders and kidnappings on behalf of the Lucchese family. Their betrayal demonstrated how far Mafia influence could still reach even during the period of decline. It also showed why honest investigations had often failed. A witness could be identified. A target could learn that police were watching him. Confidential information could pass directly to killers. Ippolito and Caracappa were eventually convicted years later, but the damage they caused was severe. Casso became a government cooperator after his arrest, hoping to receive a reduced sentence. Prosecutors later rejected his cooperation agreement, arguing that he had lied and continued criminal conduct. His case revealed another change in the criminal world. Cooperation was becoming a negotiation rather than an unthinkable betrayal. Even a man responsible for extreme violence could attempt to exchange information for leniency. The Bonanno family experienced one of the most famous internal betrayals through the undercover work of FBI agent Joseph Pistone. Beginning in the 1970s, Pistone infiltrated organized crime using the name Donnie Brasco. He spent years building relationships with associates and members connected to the Bonanno family. Pistone did not simply attend a few meetings. He participated in daily criminal life. He gained trust, discussed illegal operations, and came close to being proposed for formal Mafia membership. His work gave the FBI an unusually detailed view of how crews functioned from the inside. When the operation ended in 1981, the revelation humiliated the family. Men who had introduced Brasco and supported him faced punishment because they had failed to recognize an undercover agent. Several were marked for death. The investigation produced convictions and showed that the Mafia's reliance on personal introductions could be exploited. A careful outsider could enter the organization if trusted members believed he had proven himself. The Bonanno family was temporarily removed from the commission, partly because its internal instability and the Brasco infiltration made it appear unreliable. Exclusion from the commission was a serious loss of status. It limited the family's voice in disputes and signaled weakness to the other organizations. The Colombo family moved into another internal war during the early 1990s. Carmine Persico continued to influence the family from prison. Victor Orena, appointed as acting boss, eventually attempted to take permanent control. The organization split into factions supporting Persico and Orena. Shootings took place in public. Members and associates were killed or wounded. Business operations were disrupted. Law enforcement attention intensified. The conflict demonstrated that the Commission's ability to manage disputes had weakened. Many senior bosses were in prison. Communication was more difficult. Families were under surveillance. Leaders could no longer meet freely to impose settlements. The institutions that had once restrained violence were being dismantled at the same time the families needed them most. The Genovese family remained more stable than some of its rivals. Vincent Gigante's secrecy, use of intermediaries, and long performance of mental illness delayed prosecution. He avoided direct conversations, required members to touch their chins when referring to him, and used front bosses to confuse investigators. For years, the strategy worked. Prosecutors eventually demonstrated that his apparent illness was largely an act. Gigante was convicted in 1997 on racketeering and conspiracy charges. He later admitted in court that he had feigned mental illness to avoid prosecution. Even the most carefully hidden boss could be reached. By the end of the 20th century, the five families still existed, but the environment that had created their golden age was gone. RICO allowed prosecutors to attack the hierarchy. Electronic surveillance made private conversations dangerous. Witness protection made cooperation survivable. Long sentences made silence less attractive. Public investigations weakened political protection. Changes in the economy also reduced traditional mafia opportunities. Containerization transformed the waterfront by replacing much of the old labor-intensive cargo system. Manufacturing declined in New York. Union membership changed. Industries once controlled through local relationships became more regulated, computerized, or nationally managed. The families continued earning from gambling, loan sharking, construction, fraud, narcotics, and labor racketeering, but their control was less complete. They also faced competition from other criminal organizations that were not required to follow commission rules or traditional mafia boundaries. The decline was not a single collapse. There was no final day when the empire ended. It was a long reduction in authority. One boss went to prison. One captain became an informant. One union local was placed under federal supervision. One corrupt company lost its contract. One crew fractured after an indictment. Each event removed part of the network. The family survived because survival was built into their structure, but they could no longer replace losses as easily as before. New members entered an organization under greater surveillance and with fewer guarantees. The promise of lifelong protection had become difficult to believe when so many bosses were serving life sentences. The criminal empire had depended on the idea that the organization was permanent and the government was temporary. By the 1990s, that assumption had reversed. Investigators could spend years building one case. Prosecutors could charge an entire leadership group. Cooperators could explain the family's secrets in open court. Assets could be seized, unions supervised, and legitimate businesses removed from criminal control. The five families had once turned their hierarchy into a shield. The government had learned to turn it into a map. What remained was not the same empire that had controlled hiring on the docks, major construction contracts, and large parts of New York's illegal economy. It was smaller, more cautious, and increasingly dependent on old reputations. The name still carried weight. The structure still existed. Money was still collected, and violence had not disappeared. But the city around the families had changed, and the men inside them were no longer certain that silence, loyalty, and careful distance could protect them from the consequences of belonging. The convictions of the 1980s and 1990s ended the period when the five families could act as though they were permanent institutions beyond the reach of the government. They did not end the five families themselves. That difference is important. The Mafia lost bosses, captains, soldiers, union officials, political contacts, and large sources of income. Federal prosecutors used RICO to convict entire leadership groups. Informants explained the meaning of recorded conversations. Courts placed unions under supervision. businesses connected to organised crime lost contracts. Electronic surveillance made private meetings dangerous. The old system was badly damaged, but it did not vanish. An organisation built to survive the removal of individuals does not disappear when one famous boss receives a life sentence. The Gambino family continued after John Gotti went to prison. The Genovese family continued after Vincent Gigante was convicted. The Colombo family continued despite internal wars and the imprisonment of Carmine Persico. The Bonanno family survived Joseph Messina's cooperation with the federal government. The Lucchese family continued after Vittorio Amuso and Anthony Casso were removed from the street. The families became smaller, less visible, and more cautious. Their decline is sometimes described as though the Mafia reached the end of the 20th century and simply stopped functioning. That interpretation is attractive because it gives the story a clear conclusion. The government develops better laws, the major bosses are convicted, and the criminal empire collapses. The reality was less complete. The five families no longer controlled New York as broadly as they had during the middle of the 20th century. They could not influence major industries with the same confidence. They faced stronger law enforcement, more regulated unions, improved financial monitoring, and constant competition from other criminal organizations. They still possessed several advantages. The families had names that continued to create fear. They had relationships developed over generations. They understood illegal gambling, extortion, loan sharking, fraud, and money laundering. They knew how to place associates inside legitimate companies and how to make criminal agreements appear like ordinary business. Most importantly, they knew how to wait. A street gang may depend on visible control of a neighborhood. Its members display colors, defend territory, and use public violence to protect reputation. The modern mafia usually benefits from doing the opposite. A man who openly identifies himself as a member of a criminal organization attracts surveillance. A business that appears obviously connected to the mafia has difficulty obtaining contracts and licenses. A public murder brings investigators, news cameras, and political pressure. The families learn to reduce attention. Social clubs became less useful when agents could watch everyone entering the door. Large gatherings became too risky. Telephone conversations became shorter and less direct. Orders passed through additional intermediaries. Some bosses avoided meeting soldiers entirely. They communicated through trusted captains or relatives. Leadership titles became deliberately confusing. A family might have an official boss, an acting boss, a street boss, and senior figures who exercised influence without holding a publicly recognized position. This uncertainty protected the organization. Investigators could identify the person who appeared to be in charge and still have difficulty proving whether another man held greater authority. The Genovese family had used front bosses for years. Other families adopted similar methods as prosecutions became more effective. The modern boss had little reason to behave like John Gotti. Gotti's confidence, expensive clothing, public statements, and courthouse appearances made him famous. They also made him an obvious target. Later leaders had watched the result. Public admiration did not prevent a life sentence. The survivors returned to a quieter model. That change altered the public image of the mafia. Americans remained familiar with the five families through films, television programs, books, podcasts, and stories about famous bosses. The fictional mafia often appeared more powerful at the same time that the real organizations were becoming less visible. Popular culture preserved the restaurants, social clubs, formal clothing, induction ceremonies, and family language of an earlier period. It encouraged the belief that the mafia operated according to a firm code. The historical record shows something less orderly. Members betrayed one another. Bosses stole from soldiers. Soldiers disobeyed bosses. Informants cooperated to shorten prison sentences. Rules against narcotics were ignored when drug profits became available. Restrictions on killing were abandoned when ambitious men believed they could seize power. The code existed, but it was enforced selectively. Its most consistent purpose was to protect the organisation. Silence was praised because witnesses endangered leadership. Loyalty was praised because defections reduced revenue. Respect was demanded because hierarchy depended on obedience. Family language gave criminal relationships the appearance of permanent personal obligation. The organisation described itself as a family, while regularly killing its own members. This contradiction became harder to hide as more senior figures cooperated with the government. Joseph Massino's decision to become an informant was especially damaging. He had risen to become boss of the Bonanno family and had helped rebuild the organisation after the Donnie Brasco infiltration and years of instability. Massino was convicted in 2004 on racketeering charges that included murder. Facing the possibility of a death sentence in another case, he began cooperating with federal authorities. A sitting or recently active boss had crossed the line that Mafia tradition treated as absolute. Massino recorded conversations with Vincent Bassiano, an important Bonanno leader who believed he was speaking privately with a trusted superior. The recordings were later used by prosecutors. The cooperation showed every member of every family that rank no longer guaranteed silence. If a boss could become an informant, a soldier had less reason to believe that accepting life imprisonment represented an honourable sacrifice. The organisation's demands had always depended on the belief that everyone above and below a member accepted the same obligation. That belief was no longer credible. The government also became more capable of attacking the Mafia's financial foundations. Cash remained difficult to trace, but legitimate businesses created records. Bank transactions, property purchases, tax filings, payrolls, insurance claims and electronic communications could be examined. A construction company could be audited. A union election could be supervised. A suspected gambling operation could be studied through telephone and internet data. Financial investigations sometimes produced results that traditional surveillance could not. A criminal might refuse to discuss extortion openly, but money still had to move. A company receiving suspicious payments could lead investigators to owners, partners, and hidden beneficiaries. Asset forfeiture increased the cost of conviction. Prison had always been an occupational risk in organised crime. Losing homes, businesses, vehicles, cash, and investment properties threatened the wealth that made the risk appear worthwhile. The economic environment of New York also continued changing. The old waterfront system had been transformed by container shipping and mechanization. Fewer workers handled much larger amounts of cargo. Hiring became more regulated. Manufacturing moved away from the city. The garment district declined from its earlier scale. Many small companies disappeared or became part of national corporations with centralized accounting and security. Industries that had once depended on local personal relationships became harder to control through neighbourhood intimidation. The Mafia could still influence construction, trucking, sanitation and unions, but the opportunities were narrower and the scrutiny stronger. One of the clearest examples came from the commercial waste industry. For years, private garbage companies had divided customers among themselves through a system sometimes called the property rights arrangement. A company treated a restaurant, office or store as its permanent customer. Competitors understood that they should not offer a lower price. Organised crime helped enforce the arrangement. Business owners paid inflated rates because meaningful competition had been removed. Threats, vandalism and violence discouraged independent companies from entering the market. During the 1990s, investigations and prosecutions disrupted Mafia influence in New York's waste-hauling industry. The city introduced new licensing and oversight intended to remove companies connected to organised crime. This was the pattern of Mafia decline in practical terms. The family did not disappear from New York because one boss was arrested. It lost influence when an entire market was changed, so that intimidation no longer provided the same profit. Similar reforms affected unions and construction. Court-appointed monitors examined union records and elections. Federal consent decrees reduced the ability of criminal groups to select officers. Companies competing for public contracts faced background checks and disclosure requirements. These measures were not perfect. Corruption could return in different forms. An associate with no obvious criminal record could still serve as a hidden representative. The cost of infiltration had increased. At the same time, new technology created opportunities. Illegal gambling had always been a dependable mafia business. The basic product required no stolen merchandise and little physical infrastructure. Customers placed bets, bookmakers recorded them, and the family received a share. As betting moved to telephone services and online platforms, mafia-linked operations adapted. Bets could be managed through offshore websites, while local agents collected money and extended credit. The technology changed, but the criminal relationship remained familiar. A legal gambling company requires customer verification, taxes, responsible gambling policies, and government oversight. An illegal bookmaker can accept customers who want anonymity or credit. When a customer loses more than he can pay, the operation can use threats unavailable to a legal business. Recent federal cases show that the traditional families continue to use illegal gambling and extortion. Genovese members and associates pleaded guilty in 2024 to charges connected to long-running gambling operations, including racketeering and attempted extortion. In January 2025, a Lucchese soldier and 4 associates pleaded guilty in a case involving an illegal online gambling business, money laundering, and millions of dollars in forfeiture. These were not the activities of an empire controlling every major industry in the city. They were evidence of organizations that had adapted familiar rackets to newer systems. Loan sharking remained connected to gambling. A bettor who could not repay losses might borrow from the same network. A business owner excluded from ordinary credit could accept a high-interest loan. Weekly payments continued, and failure to pay could bring threats. The method had changed little, because it depended on a condition that still existed. Some people needed money quickly and could not or would not obtain it from a regulated lender. Fraud became increasingly attractive because it could produce large profits without public violence. Healthcare fraud, insurance fraud, securities schemes, credit card theft, tax fraud, and internet-based crime offered ways to steal through paperwork and electronic systems. Associates with business knowledge could be more valuable than street enforcers. The Mafia had always used legitimate commerce. Modern fraud simply expanded the available tools. The families also continued cooperating when profit required it. The Commission no longer appeared to function with the strength it had held during the mid-20th century. Repeated prosecutions made regular meetings among top bosses extremely dangerous. Communication between families often occurred through smaller arrangements involving captains and associates. Cooperation did not require one formal national meeting. A Genovese crew could work with Bonanno members on gambling. Gambino associates could participate in a scheme with people connected to other organizations. The old family boundaries remained important, but profitable partnerships continued to cross them. A 2016 federal case charged 46 leaders, members, and associates connected to several mafia organizations with participating in a broad East Coast enterprise. Prosecutors alleged involvement in gambling, extortion, arson, assault conspiracies, cigarette trafficking, gun trafficking, access device fraud, and healthcare fraud. The case demonstrated that cooperation had survived even when the central governing structure had weakened. The families also remained capable of reaching legitimate institutions. In 2022, federal prosecutors charged members and associates of the Genovese and Bonanno families in cases involving illegal gambling, money laundering, obstruction, and a law enforcement officer accused of providing protection. The presence of a police contact belonged to the oldest part of the Mafia's business model. Crime becomes easier when someone inside the government provides warnings, searches databases, or interferes with investigations. Modern security systems reduce certain forms of corruption while creating new types of valuable information. A corrupt officer no longer needs to carry a paper file out of a station. access to a computer system may be enough. The Gambino family also continued appearing in major federal prosecutions. In February 2026, a Gambino soldier pleaded guilty to racketeering conspiracy, extortion, witness retaliation, and a firearms offence, becoming the last of 10 defendants in a case involving members and associates of the family. The Justice Department stated that the other defendants had already pleaded guilty or been convicted. No responsible account should use these cases to suggest that the 5 families regained the authority they possessed during their golden age. They did not. The FBI has stated that its New York office convicted the leadership of all 5 families twice over in the years after September 11th, 2001. The repeated removal of senior leaders reduced continuity, experience, and the ability to control crews. Membership also became more difficult to maintain. The old Mafia drew recruits from tightly connected Italian-American neighbourhoods where criminal figures could observe young men over many years. A prospective member grew up around relatives and neighbours who could verify his background. He might begin as a teenager performing small tasks and spend a decade proving loyalty. Those neighbourhoods changed as families moved, intermarried, entered new professions, and became less isolated from wider American society. Italian Americans had never been naturally connected to organised crime. The overwhelming majority rejected it, ignored it, or suffered from the stereotype it created. As social and economic barriers declined, the Mafia had fewer opportunities to present itself as a necessary path to status and wealth. A young man could pursue education, public employment, business, or a profession that had been less accessible to his grandparents. Joining a criminal organisation became less attractive when legal opportunity increased, and federal surveillance made a long career less likely. The Mafia's ethnic restrictions also limited recruitment. Associates from any background could earn money with a family, but formal membership traditionally required Italian ancestry. Other criminal organisations could recruit more broadly and operate without the same rituals or approval processes. New York's criminal world became more diverse and decentralised. Latin American cartels controlled international drug supply chains. Russian and Eastern European groups became involved in fraud, money laundering, extortion, and other crimes. Asian criminal networks, street gangs, outlaw motorcycle clubs, and independent crews competed in markets that the 5 families could no longer dominate. The Mafia became one participant among many. Its reputation remained larger than its share of the criminal economy. That reputation still had value. A threat associated with the Gambino or Genovese family could frighten someone who knew nothing about the current size of the organisation. The victim remembered decades of stories, films, murders, and convictions. The family benefited from crimes committed long before the current member was born. This is one reason the Mafia never needed to use violence as frequently as popular culture suggests. A threat works when the target believes violence is possible. The historical record supplies the proof. A modern associate collecting a debt could refer indirectly to people behind him. He did not need to describe what would happen. The family name completed the message. Yet reputation can also become a burden. A criminal connected to one of the 5 families attracts more attention than an unknown fraudster. Investigators recognise surnames, social clubs, meeting places, and patterns of association. Prosecutors understand the hierarchy. Courts are familiar with Mafia terminology and RICO law. The families once benefited because the government did not believe a national organisation existed. That protection is gone. Law enforcement now begins with the assumption that the structure may be present. This forces modern members into a difficult balance. They need the Mafia name to intimidate victims and protect business. They need to hide the same connection from investigators. The stronger the reputation appears on the street, the easier it may be to prove association in court. That contradiction limits growth. There is also less tolerance within New York for the idea that mob control is simply part of doing business. During the Golden Age, contractors, restaurant owners, Union members and local officials sometimes treated Mafia payments as an unavoidable expense. Reporting the activity could appear pointless or dangerous. Decades of prosecutions changed expectations. Businesses developed compliance programs. Governments created inspectors general and organised crime units. Journalists and investigators studied industries vulnerable to collusion. None of these measures eliminates corruption. They reduce the number of places where criminal control can become normal without resistance. The five families remain historically important because their influence shaped New York in ways that did not disappear when their power declined. Labour reforms were created in response to their rackets. Law enforcement agencies reorganised to investigate them. RICO became one of the most important tools in American criminal prosecution. Witness protection methods expanded partly because insiders needed a way to survive after testifying. The city's systems changed because the Mafia had exploited them. The families also left a cultural inheritance that often obscures the damage. Tourists visit restaurants associated with famous mobsters. Former social clubs become points on walking tours. Murder locations are photographed. Fictional bosses are quoted as though they were philosophers. The victims are less memorable. A businessman who lost his company to a loan shark rarely became famous. A union member denied work left little public record. A taxpayer who paid more for concrete did not know which part of the bill represented criminal profit. Mafia history is easier to romanticize when the cost is spread among thousands of people. The criminal empire was not built only through spectacular killings. It was built through small payments repeated for years, $10 taken from one worker. A percentage added to one contract, interest collected from one borrower, a truckload of goods stolen and sold through an ordinary store. The money moved upward until men who appeared distant from the crimes could live comfortably and describe themselves as businessmen. That system has not disappeared completely because the conditions that support it have not disappeared. People still gamble illegally. Businesses still need emergency money. Officials can still be corrupted. Companies still benefit from eliminating competition. Criminals still look for ways to place themselves between a service and the person who needs it. The five families retain experience in exploiting those conditions. What changed is their ability to do so openly and at scale. They no longer stand above New York's underworld as unquestioned rulers. They cannot assume control over an industry simply because an old boss once controlled it. Every meeting may be recorded. Every new associate may be an informant. Every payment may become part of a racketeering case. A member entering the Mafia in the 21st century inherits the name but not the security that once accompanied it. He may still receive access to gambling operations, loans, fraud schemes, and criminal partnerships. He also inherits decades of government knowledge about how the organisation works. The authorities know what a captain is. They know why money is passed upward. They know why an acting boss may not be the real boss. They understand that an indirect order can carry a clear meaning. The secrets that once protected the families have become familiar evidence. New York continues moving around them. The docks use systems that workers from the 1930s would not recognise. Construction projects rise under layers of regulation and finance. Garment factories that once filled Manhattan have moved away or closed. Neighbourhoods associated with early Mafia history have changed through immigration, development, and rising property prices. Some old social clubs remain, others are restaurants, apartments, or empty storefronts. The places change faster than the stories. A person can walk along Mulberry Street without knowing which buildings once hosted criminal meetings. Commuters pass Sparks Steakhouse without remembering that Paul Castellano was killed outside it. Apartment residents sleep near locations where men once planned murders and divided industries. The city does not preserve every layer of its history visibly. The five families survive in a similar way. They are present, but they are no longer the system beneath everything. They operate in limited spaces, protected by caution and the remaining power of their names. Federal cases continue to show members and associates involved in gambling, extortion, fraud, money laundering, and attempts to influence legitimate businesses. The FBI still identifies the 5 New York families as active parts of La Cosa Nostra. That survival should not be confused with victory. The Mafia wanted permanence. Its ceremonies told members that the organisation would exist beyond any individual life. Its rules demanded loyalty until death. Its leaders built structures intended to outlast prison sentences, political reforms, and changes in the economy. The structure did survive, its reach did not. What remains is a reduced version of an organisation that once believed it could manage New York's criminal economy like a private government. The families can still commit crimes, exploit victims, and corrupt institutions. They can no longer assume that the city will quietly adjust around them. Their history is not the story of criminals secretly owning every street. It is the history of how power grows when people depend on services they cannot control, when corruption becomes routine, and when fear prevents small acts of resistance from joining together. The 5 families built their empire by entering the spaces between New Yorkers and the things they needed: work, credit, transportation, protection, contracts, and political assistance. They declined when those spaces became harder to occupy. The men changed, the industries changed, the law changed, the method remained recognizable. Find a necessary service, limit access to it, remove competition, offer a solution to the problem you helped create, collect money from everyone who wants ordinary life to continue. That was how the Mafia turned New York into a criminal empire. It is also why the empire, although greatly reduced, never disappeared as completely as the city sometimes preferred to believe.